The autumn had settled into a long stretch of grey mornings and still afternoons, and the dweller of the small, thatched cottage knew it was time to brighten the room before the heavy dark of winter closed in. The walls inside, made of wattle and daub between old oak beams, had grown dark from years of peat smoke and the slow accumulation of soot from the cooking fire. On this particular morning, with the sky a pale, even white and the air cool but not yet cold, the dweller took down a wicker basket from its peg near the door and stepped out onto the packed earth of the yard. The cottage stood alone at the edge of a wide field bordered by hedgerows of hawthorn and hazel that were now turning brown and yellow. Beyond the far end of the field, about a 20-minute walk across the coarse grass and fallen leaves, there was a low outcrop of limestone that the dweller had visited many times before, though never for this purpose. The stone was pale grey, nearly white in some places, and it broke into manageable pieces with a few firm strikes of a heavy wooden mallet. The dweller wore a simple tunic of undyed wool, patched at the elbows, and soft leather shoes that made almost no sound on the damp earth. The walk across the field was slow and without hurry. The grass had been cropped short by sheep earlier in the season, and now it lay flat and yellowing, dotted here and there with the dried stems of thistles. The dweller's basket swung lightly with each step, creaking softly where the withes rubbed together. A few crows passed overhead, their calls faint and far away, but otherwise the morning was entirely quiet. At the boundary of the field, the dweller paused to unloop a length of twisted hemp rope that served as a gate, then continued on toward the limestone outcrop. The stones lay jumbled at the base of a low, grassy bank, some partly buried in the soil, others fully exposed and weathered smooth by rain. The dweller set the basket down and began to walk around the outcrop, selecting pieces with care. Not every stone was suitable. Some were too crumbly, others had veins of darker mineral that would not burn well. The best pieces were the ones that felt dense and solid in the hand, that gave a clean, sharp sound when tapped with the mallet. The dweller lifted each candidate, turned it over, and either placed it in the basket or tossed it aside. Over the course of the morning, the basket slowly filled. The stones were not large, each roughly the size of a clenched fist or slightly bigger, and they clinked against each other with a dry, chalky sound as they settled. The dweller worked steadily, pausing now and then to straighten up and rest the lower back, looking out across the field toward the cottage whose thatched roof was just visible above the hedgerow. The air smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves, with a faint mineral tang from the broken stones. When the basket was full enough that its weight pressed the woven base against the ground, the dweller lifted it with both hands and began the walk back. The basket was heavy and the journey home took longer, with several stops to shift the load and to rest the arms. At one point, the dweller placed the basket on a large flat stone and sat beside it, rubbing the red marks that the handles had pressed into the palms. A light breeze moved across the field, stirring the dry grass, and then it stilled again. Back at the cottage, the dweller set the basket near the corner of the dwelling, where a small patch of bare earth would become the kiln site. The next task was to prepare the kiln itself, a simple clamp kiln of the kind that could be built in a day from materials at hand. The dweller gathered broken bricks that had been stacked behind the woodpile, remnants of some older construction, along with clumps of turf cut from the edge of the field and a supply of stiff clay dug from a shallow pit near the stream. These materials were carried to the kiln site one by one, the turf leaving dark crumbs on the dweller's tunic, the bricks dusting the hands with fine red powder. The kiln would be a small dome-shaped structure, just large enough to hold the basket of limestone. The dweller began by clearing the ground, sweeping away loose leaves and twigs with a birch broom until the soil was flat and level. Then a low circular base was laid out using the broken bricks, arranged in a ring with spaces left between them for air to flow inward. Over this, the dweller built up the walls with layers of turf, stacking the grassy clods so that the grass faced outward and the soil pressed inward, tamping each layer down with the flat of a wooden paddle to make it firm. The clay was mixed with water from the well in a small hollowed log, stirred with a stick until it became a thick, sticky paste, and then smeared into the gaps between the turves to seal them. As the little dome rose, the dweller left an opening at the front, a stoking hole just wide enough to push in fuel and to let the fire breathe. The construction was slow and patient, each sod adjusted multiple times, each gap filled and smoothed. By the time the kiln stood complete, a squat beehive shape about 3 feet high and roughly the same across, the afternoon light had begun to soften into a pale gold. The dweller brushed the dirt from hands onto the front of the tunic and stood back to examine the work. Inside the cottage, the basket of limestone waited. The dweller fetched it now, setting it beside the kiln, and then gathered kindling dry sticks from the hazel hedge, handfuls of dry bracken, some splinters of pinewood saved from the chopping block. These were pushed into the stoking hole and arranged loosely, with plenty of air between them. Over the kindling, the dweller placed the limestone pieces one by one, building a careful pile within the kiln chamber, each stone set so that the heat could circulate around it. It was like fitting together a three-dimensional puzzle, and the dweller worked slowly, testing each stone's stability before adding the next. When all the stones were in place, the dweller took a small clay pot that held a live ember from the cottage hearth. The ember glowed a dull orange beneath its coating of ash, and the dweller carried it carefully across the yard, shielding it from the breeze. Kneeling before the kiln's stoking hole, the dweller pushed the ember into the heart of the kindling, and then began to blow gently, steady, even breaths that made the ember brighten and the first thin wisps of smoke rise from the vent at the top of the dome. The fire took hold with a soft crackling sound, and the dweller sat back on the heels, watching the flames grow from tiny yellow points into a steady, licking gold that wrapped around the limestone. The smoke that rose from the kiln was pale grey at first, then darker as the dry bracken caught, and it curled upward into the still air, dissipating slowly against the flat white sky. The dweller added more sticks, feeding the fire with care, never too much at once, so that the heat would build gradually and not crack the stones. The kiln would need to burn for 2 full days to transform the limestone into quicklime. The dweller knew this from the old knowledge passed down through generations, and there was no impatience. A low wooden stool was brought from the cottage and placed a little way from the kiln, far enough to avoid the sparks that occasionally flew from the stoking hole. The dweller sat and tended the fire through the late afternoon, rising every so often to collect more wood from the pile or to adjust a piece of turf that had begun to sag. As evening approached, the air grew cooler and the dweller wrapped a woolen shawl around the shoulders. The fire in the kiln had settled into a deep, steady glow, and the stones inside were no longer visible, hidden behind a shimmer of heat. The smoke had thinned to a pale haze, and the smell of it, dry and slightly sweet from the bracken, drifted around the yard. The dweller ate a simple supper of bread and hard cheese while sitting on the stool, chewing slowly and watching the kiln. A small clay cup of ale, drawn from a crock kept cool in the pantry, was sipped between bites. When the dark came fully, the dweller lit an oil lamp and hung it from a hook driven into the wooden post that supported the cottage's lean-to. The small flame of the lamp threw a circle of orange light that mixed with the redder glow from the kiln's stoking hole, and the dweller's shadow stretched long across the ground. The task now was simply to be present, to feed the fire through the night. The dweller had prepared for this, having cut and stacked a sizable pile of wood earlier in the week, and the woodpile stood ready just a few paces away. The hours of the first night were marked by the slow repetition of feeding. Every so often, the dweller pushed a few more sticks into the opening, then settled back on the stool, then rose again after a time to check the vent at the top of the dome where a faint blue flame sometimes flickered from the escaping gases. The night was quiet, with only the occasional hoot of an owl from the distant copse and the soft, constant rustle of the kiln's fire. The moon rose behind a thin layer of cloud, giving the whole yard a dim silver-grey visibility, and the dweller did not need the lamp for a while, but let it burn anyway as a companion. By dawn of the second day, the fire had burned down slightly, and the dweller added a larger log to raise the heat again. The limestone inside the kiln was changing now, though the dweller could not see it. The heat was driving out the gases locked within the stone, leaving behind a different material, more fragile, eager to react with water. The smoke from the vent had become almost invisible, just a waver of heat that disturbed the cold morning air. The dweller stretched, walked around the yard to ease the stiffness in the legs, and then resumed the watch. The second day passed in the same quiet rhythm. The sun moved unseen behind the clouds, the light rising and falling without drama, and the dweller kept the fire steady. A neighbor from the next holding, half a mile away, walked past on the lane and raised a hand in greeting, but did not stop, seeing the kiln at work. The dweller waved back, and then returned to the stool. The smell of the burning had shifted, becoming more mineral, a faint sharpness like hot dry stone, and this was a sign that the burning was nearing its end. When the second evening came, the dweller allowed the fire to die down naturally, adding no more wood and letting the embers sink into a bed of grey ash. The kiln would need to cool completely before the quicklime could be removed, and that would take until the next morning. The dweller covered the stoking hole with a flat stone to slow the cooling and to keep out any dampness from the night air, then retreated into the cottage. Inside, the room was dim and smelled of old smoke, but the dweller paid it no mind, preparing a bowl of pottage and eating it by the light of the small hearth fire before lying down on the straw mattress to sleep. The morning of the third day was clear and cool, with a light frost crisping the grass. The dweller rose early, washed the hands and face in cold water from the well bucket, and then went out to the kiln. The turf dome was still warm to the touch but no longer hot. The covering stone was removed from the stoking hole, and the dweller peered inside, seeing the transformed lumps of quicklime, now pale and slightly shrunken, fissured with tiny cracks, no longer the grey dense stones that had been gathered from the outcrop. They were almost white, with a dusty surface that came off on the fingers like fine powder. Carefully, the dweller reached in with a pair of wooden tongs and began to draw out the quicklime lumps, placing them into a clean wooden bucket. Each lump was lighter than before, more porous, and they made a soft clinking sound as they dropped into the bucket. The dweller picked out every piece, even the small fragments from the bottom of the kiln, until the bucket was full. The quicklime seemed to hum with a kind of quiet potential, ready to react, and the dweller handled it with respect, knowing that it could burn the skin if touched for long, and that water would release its hidden heat. The bucket was carried indoors and set in the cool corner where the lime putty would later be made. The dweller then returned to the yard and began to dismantle the kiln, breaking apart the turf and bricks, because the materials could be used again for some other purpose. The ashes were scattered over the garden patch where they would sweeten the soil, and the bricks were restacked behind the woodpile. By midday, the kiln site was nearly as it had been before, just a patch of bare earth slightly scorched at the center, soon to be washed clean by rain. The dweller stood for a moment looking at the bucket of quicklime through the open doorway. The first stage of the work was complete. The stones had been gathered, the kiln built and fired, the quicklime carried safely inside. The walls of the cottage still stood dark and untouched, but the means to brighten them now rested in that wooden bucket, covered with a piece of sacking to keep out the damp. The dweller felt a quiet sense of readiness, not triumph, but a simple satisfaction, that the old knowledge had been applied correctly and that the next steps could soon begin. The afternoon was spent on small tasks that had been waiting, mending a tear in the woolen shawl with a bone needle and coarse thread, trimming the wick of the oil lamp, sweeping the hearth. The bucket of quicklime sat in its corner like a guest that had not yet been properly introduced, and the dweller passed it many times, aware of its silent presence. The light through the small window shifted across the floor, a pale rectangle that travelled slowly over the beaten earth, and the dweller moved through the day without haste, resting when the body asked for rest, eating when hunger came. By evening, the cottage was tidy, and the dweller sat on the low stool, looking at the dark walls with a new attention. The soot that had seemed a permanent part of the fabric of the room now appeared temporary, a layer that might be lifted away. The oak beams, blackened with years of smoke, held the promise of a lighter shade beneath. The dweller did not speak, for there was no one to speak to, but the thoughts circled calmly around the future work. The slaking of the lime, the mixing of the whitewash, the application of each coat. These tasks would fill the coming days, and for now it was enough to have the quicklime ready and the fire's work done. The night came, and the dweller banked the hearth fire with ash so that a few live embers would remain until morning, then lay down on the straw mattress and pulled the wool blanket up to the chin. The cottage was dark, but for the faintest orange glow at the hearth, and the air inside was still and cool. Somewhere in the corner, the bucket of quicklime sat under its sacking, quiet and dry, holding within it the light that would soon be spread across the walls. The dweller closed the eyes and let the memory of the kiln's warmth, The smell of the burning bracken and the rhythm of the two-day fire drift into the background of sleep. The bucket of quicklime had rested in the cool corner of the cottage through the night, covered by a folded square of coarse sacking, and the dweller felt its presence as a quiet expectation upon waking. Morning light pressed pale and thin through the single small window, the oiled linen cloth pushed a little aside, and the room held its familiar smell of old soot and packed earth. Yet now there was a new element, a faint mineral dryness that hung near the bucket, as though the stones themselves were breathing something invisible into the air. The dweller rose from the straw mattress, folded the wool blanket into a neat roll at the foot of the bed frame, and set about the first small routines of the day. The hearth fire was coaxed back to life from its banked embers, a few dry twigs and a split log added, and a pot of water hung over the growing flame to warm. Washing was done at the wooden bench beneath the window. Cold water from a clay pitcher splashed onto the hands and face, dried with a scrap of linen that was then hung over a peg. Only after these things were done, and a simple breakfast of oat porridge eaten slowly from a wooden bowl, did the dweller turn attention fully to the quicklime. The bucket was carried from the corner into the center of the room, where the light from the open doorway fell brightest. The dweller removed the sacking and looked down at the transformed stones. They were not stones anymore, in the true sense, being changed by the fire into something drier, hungrier, more fragile. Their surface was pale cream to white, veined with tiny cracks, and a fine dust had settled at the bottom of the bucket, like the first layer of what they were to become. The smell that rose from them was sharp and clean, catching at the back of the throat like a promise of change. The task of slaking required a trough, and the dweller fetched the one kept outside, a length of alder trunk hollowed out long ago by a patient craftsman. It was perhaps 2 handspans wide, and as long as an arm, its interior smoothed by years of use, its outer bark still clinging in brown-grey curls. The trough was placed on the beaten earth floor directly before the hearth, where it would catch both the daylight from the door and the warmth from the small fire. The dweller wiped its inside with a damp rag to remove any dust that had settled, then positioned it level by tucking a thin piece of shingle under one end. Now the quicklime lumps were transferred one by careful one from the bucket into the trough. They made a soft scraping sound as they tumbled against the wood, and the dweller arranged them in a single layer, not piled too high, so that each piece would meet the water evenly. The hands were dusted with white powder by the time this was done, and the dweller brushed them together over the trough to let the dust fall back where it belonged. The water was waiting in a wooden pail near the door, drawn fresh from the well that morning. The well stood a short walk from the cottage, its stone rim worn smooth by countless buckets rising and falling, and the water within it was consistently cold, tasting of deep earth and clean rock. The dweller lifted the pail and set it beside the trough, and for a moment there was a pause, a stillness, as though the room itself understood that a small transformation was about to occur. Slaking quicklime is a thing done slowly, for the reaction is eager and must be restrained. The dweller knew this and moved with the deliberate care of someone who had seen the process before, perhaps in childhood, watching an elder prepare the whitewash for a spring cleaning. The first addition of water was the most important. A small dipper made from a hollowed knot of elm was dipped into the pail, and the dweller poured a thin trickle of cold water over the nearest lump of quicklime. There was no immediate drama, only a quiet fizzing hiss, barely audible, like the sound of a distant stream over pebbles, and then a wisp of steam rose from the wetted surface. The dweller added more water, pouring it in a slow circle that moved from lump to lump, never flooding any one spot, but letting the liquid seep into the crevices of the quicklime in its own time. The hissing grew louder, a soft chorus of many tiny reactions, and the steam thickened until it rose in a continuous white column that curled upward and spread across the low ceiling like a fog. The small window fogged completely, its linen cover becoming limp and translucent from the moisture, and the dweller's face felt the gentle heat of the exothermic change, a warmth that was not of the hearth but of the lime itself, releasing the fire it had stored in the kiln. The lumps began to crumble even as the water touched them. They did not dissolve as sugar would dissolve. Rather, they fell apart into a heavy sludge, each piece collapsing from the inside out, slumping into a soft mound that steamed and swelled. The dweller added water in small dipperfuls, watching with calm attention as the trough filled with a thick white paste that seemed to move slightly of its own accord, settling and shifting. The smell of the slaking lime filled the cottage, a clean mineral sharpness that was not unpleasant, like the smell of river stones after a hot day, but keener, more focused. With a hazel pole smoothed of all its bark and rounded at one end, the dweller began to stir the mixture. The pole was long enough to stand while stirring, which kept the dweller safely above the rising steam. The stirring was slow and circular, the paste resisting a little at first, then yielding into a smoother consistency. The dweller worked around the trough, lifting the pole and moving it to another spot, ensuring that all the lumps were broken apart and that no dry quicklime remained hidden in the corners. Steam continued to coil upward, and the dweller's hands grew warm and damp, the pole slippery with a thin coating of lime. More water was added, not measured by volume, but by the feel of the paste against the stirring pole. The everyday hearers and rose to survives, the substance of it hold history, if managed slightly, but would also spread easily under a brush. The dweller tested this by letting a small amount cling to the end of the pole and then tilting it. The putty slid slowly, leaving a smooth trail behind it. When it seemed just right, the dweller stopped adding water and stirred a few final times, a slow, even motion that made the surface of the putty level itself into a flat white plane within the trough. The hissing had stopped now, the steam had cleared from the air, and the window was slowly unfogging as the temperature inside the cottage returned to normal. The dweller set down the hazel pole and wiped the hands on a rag that would soon be stiff with dried lime, looking into the trough with quiet satisfaction. The quicklime had become something new, a material ready to be purified and then used. Yet there was one more step before the putty could be set aside to mature, the straining. A coarse linen cloth was brought out from the cupboard, a square of tough woven flax that had been washed many times and was now soft despite its rough weave. The dweller draped this cloth over the opening of a second clean wooden bucket, pressing it down slightly to form a shallow pocket. Then, using a flat wooden paddle, the lime putty was scooped from the trough and transferred in generous dollops onto the linen. The paddle scraped the trough's wooden hollow with a soft, wet sound, and the dweller worked patiently, making certain that nothing was wasted. Once the cloth held a manageable amount, the dweller gathered its edges together and twisted them into a tight bundle. The straining began. The dweller pressed and squeezed the bundle with both hands, forcing the smooth putty through the weave of the linen, while any remaining grit, small unburnt cores or pieces of wood ash trapped in the quicklime stayed behind. The putty came through in thick white ropes that dropped into the bucket below with a soft, wet plop. The sound repeated at a steady rhythm as the dweller worked, a slow cadence that matched the pace of breathing. When the first bundle was exhausted, the cloth was opened, and the remaining dry debris tapped out into a small clay bowl set aside for that purpose. The debris was surprisingly little, a few greyish specks, a tiny hard core no bigger than a pea that had resisted the kiln's heat, some flecks of charcoal from the burnt bracken. These would be thrown onto the garden patch later, where they would do no harm. The dweller refilled the cloth and strained again, repeating the process until the trough was empty and the bucket held a smooth, heavy mass of pure lime putty, unblemished and even in texture. The smell of the strained putty was still mineral and sharp, but now had a softer edge, tempered by the water and the air. The dweller smoothed the surface of the putty with the back of the paddle, leveling it, and then poured a thin film of clean water over the top to seal it from the air. A second bucket was not needed. The quantity was just right for the dimensions of the cottage walls, the old knowledge having guided the amount of limestone gathered and burned. A damp cloth was now taken from a bowl of water where it had been soaking, wrung out loosely, and laid directly over the surface of the putty. The cloth would keep the lime moist and prevent it from drying out during the days of maturation, for lime putty improves with age, the particles growing finer, and the bond with the wall becoming stronger. The dweller carried the bucket back to its cool corner, the same corner where the quicklime had waited, and set it down gently on the tamped earth. The cloth was checked to make sure it covered the entire surface, and then the dweller left it alone. The slaking was complete. What had been grey limestone from a grassy outcrop was now a creamy white putty, patient and ready. The cottage interior felt different for its presence. the air somehow cleaner, as if the slaking process had drawn some of the old smoky staleness out of the walls. The dweller washed the trough outside with water from the pail, scrubbing it with a handful of dried grass to remove the last traces of lime, and then set it upside down against the cottage wall to dry. The hazel pole and the paddle were rinsed as well, and the linen straining cloth was taken to the stream later to be washed thoroughly, for lime would rot the fibres if left too long. The remainder of the day unfolded in the unhurried manner of all cottage days. The dweller attended to the fire, adding a log now and then, swept the area around the hearth and sat on the stool to repair a small tear in a woolen sleeve. The bucket of lime putty rested in the corner, silent and still under its damp cloth, and the dweller glanced at it once or twice as if to confirm it had not changed, though of course it was changing in ways too slow to see, the particles settling and aligning, the whole mass becoming more cohesive. Outside, the sky had cleared somewhat, and a weak sun shone through the thin clouds, casting a pale light that moved across the floor of the cottage as the afternoon passed. The dweller took a short walk to the stream to wash the cloth, kneeling on a flat stone at the water's edge and working the cold water through the fabric until it ran clear. The stream moved slowly over its bed of brown pebbles, and a single late dragonfly skimmed the surface before vanishing into the reeds. The walk back was slow, the wet cloth draped over an arm, and the dweller noticed how the landscape had taken on the muted browns and greys of true autumn, the trees nearly bare, the fields empty. Back inside, the damp cloth was hung from a peg to dry, for it would be needed again in the coming days to cover the putty. The dweller ate a supper of bread and soft cheese, accompanied by a stewed apple kept from the small orchard at the edge of the holding. The apple had softened in the pot with a little honey and water, and its sweetness felt like a small comfort against the cooling season. While eating, the dweller considered the walls of the room, noting the areas where the old soot was thickest, the cracks that would need filling before the whitewash could be applied. A mental list was made, unhurried and without worry, simply an ordering of the next tasks. The lime putty would need to mature for several days, so the cleaning of the walls and the filling of the gaps would fill the waiting time nicely. The dweller decided to begin the next morning, after the dew had dried, and to work systematically from the top of the walls down to the floor. For the remainder of the evening, there was nothing more to do but let the fire burn low and watch the light fade. When darkness came, the dweller lit the single oil lamp and placed it on the wooden shelf, where it cast a small circle of orange glow. The bucket in the corner was just visible at the edge of the light, a dark silhouette with a faintly paler top, where the damp cloth reflected a sliver of brightness. The dweller sat on the stool and thought about the brightness that would soon spread across all these walls. Not a garish white, but a soft, warm off-white, the colour of fresh cream or the inner flesh of an almond. The room would not become larger, but it would feel less confined, and that was a worthy goal for the dark winter months ahead. Sleep came easily that night. The dweller banked the fire as usual, checked that the damp cloth was still covering the lime putty, and lay down on the straw mattress with the wool blanket pulled close. The smell of the lime had faded to a faint, clean note, barely distinguishable from the normal air of the cottage. As the dweller drifted toward rest, the mind replayed the day's central image, the white steam rising from the trough, the quicklime crumbling into paste, the slow stirring with the hazel pole. It was a calm memory without drama or tension, and it carried the dweller smoothly into a deep and dreamless sleep. The morning arrived with a thin mist that clung to the fields and softened every outline, and the dweller rose to find the cottage filled with the same cool grey light that had become familiar as autumn deepened. The bucket of lime putty sat in its corner under the damp cloth, unchanged in appearance, quietly maturing as it waited. The dweller gave it a brief glance, noting that the cloth still held moisture, and then turned attention to the work that must come before any whitewash could be applied. The slow and thorough cleaning of the walls. The interior of the cottage had not been properly cleaned in a long while, and the evidence of this lay everywhere on the wattle and daub panels and the dark oak crock beams. Years of peat smoke rising from the central hearth had deposited a fine sticky soot that clung to every surface, mixing with the ordinary dust of a dwelling to form a grey-black film. In places where the smoke had been thickest, near the roof and around the hearth opening, this film was almost glossy, a dark varnish that seemed to absorb what little light came through the window. The dweller looked at the walls with a practical eye, not dismayed, but simply taking stock of what needed to be done. The first tool for the day was the besom broom, a rough bundle of birch twigs tied tightly around a smooth ash handle, which hung from a peg near the door. The dweller took it down and tested the bindings, pulling the twine to make sure it was still secure. The broom had been made earlier that year in the spring, when the birch was full of sap and the twigs were flexible, and it had since worn into a shape that fitted the hand. A kerchief was tied over the dweller's hair to keep out the falling dust, and the single stool was moved to the center of the room so that it would not be in the way. Sweeping a wall is not like sweeping a floor, for the dirt does not simply gather at the bottom, but floats and drifts and resettles. The dweller began at the highest point of the back wall, where the wattle met the underside of the thatch. Standing on tiptoe with the broom extended upward, the first stroke of the birch twigs against the dry daub sent a cascade of fine black dust into the air, along with several pale flakes of old lime that had remained from some long ago whitewashing. The dust hung in the air like a small cloud, catching the light from the doorway and swirling before slowly settling. The dweller paused, waiting for the worst of it to fall, and then swept again, this time with a more controlled stroke that dragged the loosened dirt downward. A rhythm developed as the dweller worked across the upper portion of the wall. Each stroke of the broom began at the top and moved downward in a straight line, the birch twigs making a soft, dry whispering sound against the daub. After every few strokes, the dweller tapped the broom against the floor to knock loose the accumulated soot from the twigs, and the tap made a dull, hollow sound on the beaten earth. The dust that fell to the floor was not ordinary dust, but a fine, dark powder that smelled faintly of old smoke and dry clay, and it spread in a thin layer around the base of the wall. The timbers presented a different challenge, for the oak beams were not flat like the panels, but rounded and irregular, with deep cracks and knots where soot had gathered in stubborn concentrations. The dweller worked the broom into these crevices, twisting the twigs to reach the deeper recesses, and the soot came away in small dry chunks that dropped straight down. The beams were dark, almost black, and it was hard to believe they had once been a warm honey brown. Yet here and there, where the broom had scrubbed especially hard, a hint of the original wood grain showed through, a faint pale line that hinted at the transformation to come. The dweller swept all four walls in this manner, moving clockwise around the room, from the upper portions down to shoulder height. It was slow work, and the arms grew tired from holding the broom overhead, so the dweller paused often to rest and to let the airborne dust settle. During these pauses, a cup of water was drunk from the clay pitcher, and the dweller stood in the open doorway, looking out at the mist as it slowly lifted from the fields, revealing the bare hedgerows and the distant line of trees along the stream. After the upper walls were swept, the dweller knelt on a folded sack to reach the lower panels. Here the soot was less thick, for smoke rises, but there was more ordinary dirt, spatters of mud from the floor, spots of grease from cooking, the grubby marks left by hands and shoulders brushing against the wall over the course of daily life. The broom was less effective on these marks, so the dweller set it aside and prepared a pail of warm water for washing. The pail was the same wooden bucket that had carried water for the slaking of the lime, now thoroughly rinsed and clean. Warm water was taken from the small iron pot that hung over the hearth, mixed with cold water from the well until it was just comfortably warm, and a rag of coarse linen was placed into it to soak. The dweller also took down a second rag, this one dry, and tucked it into the belt for later use. The washing of the walls would be done by hand, panel by panel, with the same slow patience that marked all the tasks of the cottage. Beginning again at the top of the first wall, the dweller wet the rag, wrung it out so that it was damp, not dripping, and began to wipe the daub in broad, overlapping circles. The first pass of the rag came away black, and the dweller rinsed it in the pail immediately, watching the clean water turn cloudy and then grey. The rinse water would need to be changed often, and the dweller had anticipated this, setting a second pail of clean water near the door for just this purpose. The washing continued, and with each pass the surface of the daub grew lighter, revealing its natural colour, a warm pale brown, the colour of dried clay, which had been hidden under the soot for so long. The beams, when washed, released their soot more reluctantly. The oak had absorbed years of smoke into its pores, and the dweller had to scrub with a bit more effort. The rag pressed hard and moved along the grain in short, firm strokes. The warming water softened the soot slightly, and gradually the beams began to show their true color. Not a light color, but a deep, rich brown that still held some darkness in its depths. The dweller did not expect to remove every trace of smoke, for that would require scraping or sanding beyond the scope of this cleaning, but the difference was already visible. The beams were no longer black, and the whole room seemed to breathe a little more easily. All the while, the light in the cottage shifted as the sun, invisible behind the high grey clouds, moved through the sky. The open doorway let in a steady flow of cool, fresh air that carried away the dust and the smell of disturbed soot, and the dweller welcomed this ventilation, pausing now and then to look out at the unchanging view of the field and the hedgerow. A robin came and perched on the handle of an overturned barrow just outside the door, watching for a moment before flying off, and the dweller noted its presence without interrupting the work. By the time the washing reached the lower panels, the water in the rinsing pail had grown dark and thick, and the dweller carried it outside to empty onto the roots of the old hazel bush that grew beside the cottage. The cleaning continued with fresh water, and the lower walls yielded their dirt more quickly than the upper ones, being less impregnated with smoke. The area around the hearth was the most stubborn, for here the soot was mixed with a fine film of grease from cooking, and the dweller added a small pinch of wood ash to the rag to act as a mild abrasive, rubbing gently in circles until the grease lifted and the door beneath was clean to the touch. When the last panel had been washed and dried with the spare rag, the dweller stood back and looked at the room with a quiet, measuring gaze. The difference was already remarkable, though no whitewash had yet been applied. The walls were now a uniform pale brown, the color of good earth, and the oak beams, while still dark, were a warm brown that gave the room a softer feeling. The light from the doorway seemed to travel further into the corners, and the smell of the cottage had changed. The old smoky staleness was gone, replaced by the clean, slightly earthy scent of damp clay and fresh air. Now the cracks and holes became visible, for the cleaning had stripped away the disguising layer of soot and revealed the small damages that time had worked on the wattle and daub. Here a crack ran down from the edge of a window frame, where the daub had dried and shrunk away from the wood. There a hole the size of a thumb had appeared, where a knot in a hazel wattle had fallen out, leaving a dark opening into the space between the inner and outer layers of the wall. The dweller walked slowly around the room, noting each flaw, touching the edges of the cracks with a fingertip to gauge their depth, and compiling that same mental list that had been started the day before. The mending of these imperfections required a fresh batch of cob, the same mixture of clay, straw, and sand that formed the original panels. The dweller fetched a shallow wooden tray and set it on the floor near the hearth, then went outside to gather the materials. The clay was dug from the small pit near the stream, the same pit that had supplied the clay for the kiln, and it was carried back in a basket, a heavy, dense mass of pale grey-blue earth that smelled of deep ground and clean water. The sand came from a store kept in a lidded crock beside the woodpile, a coarse golden sand that had been gathered from the stream bank the previous summer and dried in the sun. The straw was taken from a tied bundle under the eaves, and the dweller selected the finest pieces, cutting them into short lengths no longer than a finger with a small iron knife. The mixing of cob was a task that engaged both hands and the whole body, and the dweller knelt on the folded sack and began to work on the wooden tray. The clay was first broken into small pieces and sprinkled with a little water from the pail, then kneaded with the palms until it softened and became pliable. The sand was added gradually, a handful at a time, folded into the clay with a pressing, rolling motion, and the dweller paused every so often to feel the texture, adding a bit more sand or a bit more water as the mixture required. When the clay sand base was smooth and held together without crumbling, the straw was scattered over the surface and worked in with a lifting and turning of the whole mass until the fibers were evenly distributed and the cob had the rough, cohesive feel of a heavy bread dough. The dweller carried the tray of cob to the first crack, a long vertical split beside the doorframe, and began the mending. A flat wooden spatula, worn smooth by use, was used to press the cob into the crack. The dweller started at the top and worked down, pushing the mixture deep into the gap with the edge of the spatula, then smoothing the surface level with the surrounding wall. Excess cob was scraped away and returned to the tray, and the filled crack was left slightly proud, for the dweller knew that the cob would shrink a little as it dried and could be smoothed again later if needed. Each crack and hole was treated with the same careful attention. The hole left by the missing knot in the wattle required a wad of straw to be pushed in first, acting as a plug that the cob could grip against, and then the cob was packed over it in layers, each layer pressed firmly before the next was added. The dweller worked patiently, and the tray of cob diminished slowly as the afternoon passed, the mixture being transferred inch by inch from the tray to the walls. Around the hearth, where the heat had caused the daub to crack in a web of fine lines, the dweller used a thinner mixture of clay and water, almost a slip, and worked it into the cracks with a fingertip, smoothing it over until the surface felt continuous. The stone hearth itself was stable and needed no repair, but the dweller checked each stone with a gentle push to make sure none had loosened and all were firm. When the last hole was filled and the last crack smoothed, the dweller cleaned the tray and the spatula with water and put away the leftover cob, covering it with a damp cloth so that it could be used again if any repairs were needed after the whitewashing began. The room now had a patchwork look, with darker fresh cob spots standing out against the pale brown of the cleaned daub, but the dweller knew that these would fade as they dried and would vanish entirely under the coats of limewash. The important thing was that the walls were now whole, free of gaps that might let in draughts or moisture, and ready to receive their brightening. The cleaning and mending had taken the entire day, from early morning to late afternoon, and the dweller felt a deep, wholesome tiredness in the arms and shoulders. The floor was swept of all the dust and debris that had fallen, the tools were returned to their places, and the wet rags were hung outside to dry on a line of twine stretched between two posts. The dweller then washed at the bench, using a handful of the wood ash to scrub away the clay and soot from the hands, and put on a clean tunic from the wooden chest. With the room tidied and the light beginning to fade, the dweller prepared a simple supper of barley broth and a thick slice of dark bread, eaten while sitting on the stool in the center of the now clean room. The walls seemed to hold the twilight longer than before, their lighter color reflecting the grey sky from the window rather than swallowing it. The bucket of lime potty in the corner seemed less like a visitor and more like the natural next step in a process that was unfolding as it should. The dweller chewed the bread slowly, thinking about the mixing of the whitewash that would come next and about the careful application of each coat. But those thoughts were for another day. For now, the work of preparation was complete, and the cottage felt settled and ready, its walls clean and whole, its air fresh and cool. The first small bird of the evening sang somewhere near the hedgerow, and the dweller closed the door against the growing chill, banking the fire so that the room would hold its warmth through the night. Sleeping came easily, in a room that already seemed a little brighter even without the lime. The lime potty had been resting under its damp cloth in the cool corner of the cottage for several days, and the dweller had not disturbed it during that time, allowing the slow chemistry of maturation to do its quiet work. The cleaning and mending of the walls were complete, the fresh cob patches had dried to a pale tan that nearly matched the surrounding daub, and the whole room now felt ready for the next stage. On this particular morning, with a steady soft rain falling outside and the sound of it tapping on the thatch like 1,000 tiny fingers, the dweller decided it was time to mix the whitewash. The bucket of lime putty was carried from its corner to the center of the room, where the light from the open doorway, though grey and diffuse, was strongest. The dweller set the bucket down on the beaten earth floor and removed the damp cloth, folding it and setting it aside in case it should be needed again. The surface of the putty was smooth and white, with a thin film of water still standing over it from the last moistening, and the smell that rose from it was no longer sharp, but mellow and clean, like the smell of wet stone after a summer rain. The putty had firmed slightly during its rest, and when the dweller pressed a fingertip into the surface, it left a neat indent that held its shape without cracking or oozing water. The mixing required a clean vessel, so the dweller fetched the same hollowed log trough that had been used for slaking the quicklime, now thoroughly washed and dried, and placed it near the bucket. A second bucket of fresh cold water was drawn from the well and set down beside the workspace, along with a small clay cup for measuring and the smooth hazel stirring pole. The dweller also brought out a tiny linen pouch that had been tucked into a crack between the beams, and from it shook a coarse grey sea salt into a wooden bowl. The salt had been traded for a basket of dried beans at the autumn market, and it was valued not for flavour alone, but for the strength it would lend to the whitewash, helping it bind to the walls and resist flaking over time. The process of mixing began with transferring the lime putty. The dweller used the flat wooden paddle to scoop the thick white paste from the storage bucket into the trough, working carefully to lift all of it without spilling. The potty came away in heavy, smooth dollops that slumped softly into the trough, and the dweller scraped the sides of the bucket clean, leaving only a thin white smear that would be rinsed later. The amount of putty filled the trough to perhaps half its depth, a substantial mass of material that would yield enough whitewash for all the walls and the timbers too. Now the dweller took the hazel pole and began to stir the putty alone, breaking up its dense structure and softening it. The stirring was slow at first, the pole encountering resistance, and then easier as the putty warmed slightly to the motion. The dweller added no water yet, only worked the paste until it became looser and more pliable under the pole, its surface growing glossy with the moisture released from within. The motion was steady and circular, the pole moving around the trough in a rhythm that matched the rain outside, which had now settled into a constant, gentle hiss. With the putty softened, the dweller reached for the clay cup and dipped it into the bucket of fresh water. The first addition of water was small, no more than half a cup, poured slowly in a thin stream over the surface of the putty, while the pole continued its stirring. The water sat for a moment in a shallow pool, then was drawn into the lime, the white paste absorbing it greedily and turning a shade darker, more translucent. The dweller stirred the water through, watching the consistency change, and then added another half cup, and then another, each addition followed by a period of stirring to incorporate it fully. The whitewash was not meant to be thin like milk, but rather like heavy cream that coats the back of a spoon and drips slowly. The danger in mixing was adding too much water too quickly, which would weaken the wash and make it run down the walls without covering well. The dweller knew this from the old knowledge and proceeded with patience, adding water in small amounts, pausing to observe how the mixture behaved. The hazel pole was lifted now and then, and the whitewash clinging to it was watched closely as it dripped back into the trough. When the mixture was just right, the drips fell in heavy white drops that held their shape for a moment before merging with the surface, and the pole itself was coated with a smooth, even white film. The salt came next. The dweller took the wooden bowl and measured out a modest handful of the coarse grey crystals, not so much that the whitewash would become gritty, but enough to work the old magic of adhesion. The salt was tipped into the trough, and the dweller stirred it through with the same slow circular motion, watching the crystals dissolve gradually into the lime, leaving behind only a faint speckling that soon vanished. The second handful was considered an added, smaller than the first because the walls near the hearth would face some warmth, and the extra salt would help the lime hold fast there. The stirring continued until no grain of salt could be felt under the pole, the mixture now uniform and smooth. The whitewash at this stage had a pale, creamy appearance, almost luminous even in the dim light of the cottage, and the dweller paused to look at it with quiet satisfaction. But the mixture was not yet ready for the walls, for there remained the crucial step of testing. A patch of wattle behind the door, a place that was not easily seen, and where a test could dry without marring the visible surfaces, had been selected earlier. The dweller took a small brush made of a few basswood fibers tied to a short stick, dipped it into the whitewash, and applied a neat square of the liquid to the wall. The test patch, as it touched the daub, turned greyish and translucent, the colour of a rain cloud, and the dweller watched it for a moment before leaving it to dry. The rain continued outside, and the dweller used the waiting time to tidy the workspace, rinse the clay cup in the water pail, and place the hazel pole across the rim of the trough. A cup of water was drunk, and the fire was fed a single log to keep the chill at bay, for the day was cool and damp. The test patch dried slowly in the humid air, and the dweller checked it often, first after an hour, then after another. The change from greyish wetness to opaque white happened gradually, like a cloud thinning to reveal the sky behind it. By late morning, the test patch was fully dry, and the dweller examined it with care. The white was good, a soft, chalky white that did not flake when rubbed lightly with a fingertip, and the edges were clean without peeling. The salt had done its work, for the patch seemed firmly bonded to the daub, and the dweller nodded to no one but the walls themselves. The consistency was therefore judged correct, and no further adjustment was needed. Had the test patch been too thin and translucent, more putty would have been stirred in. Had it been too thick and prone to cracking, a little more water would have been added. But the old measurements, passed down without written record, had proven true. With the test complete, the dweller turned to the final preparation of the whitewash, which now needed to be strained one last time to remove any tiny lumps or bits of debris that might spoil the smoothness of the application. The same coarse linen cloth that had been used for straining the putty was brought out, now clean and dry, and it was draped over the opening of the working bucket that would be carried from wall to wall during the whitewashing. The dweller ladled the whitewash from the trough onto the cloth in careful scoopfuls, letting the liquid seep through the weave into the bucket below. The straining cloth caught a few small irregularities, a tiny core of unburned lime no bigger than a millet seed, a few fibers from the hazel pole that had worked loose, a single grain of salt that had not fully dissolved. These were tapped into the clay bowl with the earlier debris, and the cloth was rinsed immediately in the water pail to prevent the lime from hardening in its fibers. The working bucket was now full of smooth, creamy whitewash, its surface reflecting the grey light from the doorway like a mirror of milk. The dweller set it on the floor and covered it loosely with a clean cloth to keep out dust, for the actual application would begin the next morning when the dweller was fresh and the light was good. The trough was taken outside and rinsed under the dripping eaves. The hazel poles wiped down, and all the tools were put away in their proper places. The remainder of the day was spent in a kind of calm readiness. The dweller prepared the brushes that would be used to apply the whitewash, inspecting the tied base wood fibers and tightening the bindings where they had loosened. 2 brushes of different sizes were laid out, a large one for the broad surfaces of the wattie panels, and a smaller one for the edges around the timbers and the hearth. A wooden spatula was placed nearby for any needed touching up, and several clean rags were folded and set on the shelf. The dweller also moved the stool and the small table to the center of the room, covering them with a length of old sacking to protect against drips. All the while, the cottage walls stood clean and ready, their pale brown surfaces waiting to receive the brightness that now sat in a bucket under a cloth. The dweller moved through the afternoon with a quiet sense of anticipation, performing the small rituals of daily life, mending a loose button on a tunic with a bone needle, adding water to the pot of beans soaking near the hearth, stepping outside briefly to check that the rain had not flooded the path to the well. The rain continued into the evening, a steady grey curtain that blurred the fields and kept the world enclosed, and the dweller found comfort in the sound of it, in the knowledge that the cottage was dry and that the whitewash was ready. Supper was a simple dish of warmed beans, with a piece of hard bread softened in the broth, eaten while sitting on the covered stool. The light from the oil lamp flickered on the clean walls and on the bucket of whitewash, which seemed almost to glow in the dimness. The dweller ate slowly, thinking of the application to come, of the careful strokes that would cover each panel and beam, of the way the room would look when the first coat began to dry. There was no hurry, no pressing need, only the steady rhythm of a task approaching its culmination. Before sleep, the dweller checked the whitewash one last time, lifting the cloth and stirring the mixture gently with a wooden spoon to prevent any settling. The surface swirled briefly and then smoothed, as white and even as before. The cloth was replaced, and the bucket was moved slightly closer to the hearth where it would not grow too cold during the night. The fire was banked, the door was barred against the rain, and the dweller lay down on the straw mattress with the wool blanket drawn close. The sound of the rain continued overhead, a soft, unending rustle that filled the dark room without disturbing it. The dweller closed the eyes and let the mind rest on the image of the whitewash bucket, of the test patch on the wall that was now invisible in the darkness, but that would be a bright square in the morning light. The process of mixing was complete, and the application would follow with a new day, a slow and methodical spreading of whiteness that would transform the cottage from within. With that thought, calm and without urgency, the dweller drifted into sleep, the rain keeping its steady watch over the fields and the small thatched house. The day chosen for the first coat of whitewash arrived with a stillness in the air that promised neither rain nor wind, only the muted grey calm of late autumn. The dweller had risen early, even before the first pale light had fully separated from the dark, and had eaten a quiet breakfast of rye bread, softened in warm milk, while sitting on the stool near the rekindled hearth. The bucket of whitewash, which had spent the night near the fire's residual warmth, was uncovered and stirred once more with the wooden spoon to ensure no settling had occurred. Its surface swirled briefly, then returned to a smooth, even cream, ready for the walls. The tools for the application had been laid out the previous evening on the wooden shelf, the broad brush of tied basswood fibers with its short ash handle, the smaller brush for the edges, a wooden spatula wrapped in a clean rag, and a clay bowl of fresh water for rinsing the brushes if they should begin to clog. The dweller had also folded a length of old sacking and placed it on the floor directly below the starting point to catch any drips, and the stool had been moved to the center of the room, also covered, so that the floor was as protected as it could be from the inevitable small splashes. The whitewashing would begin at the top of the cottage interior, where the wattle and daub panels met the underside of the thatch. This high area was the darkest part of the room, for it had received the most smoke over the years and the least light, and it was here that the transformation would be most visible. The dweller carried the working bucket to the back wall, setting it on the floor a little to the side so that it would not be directly under the path of the brush, and then stood for a moment looking up at the expanse of dark textured daub and the heavy oak crook beam that slanted down from the ridge. The broad brush was lifted from the shelf, and its handle was gripped lightly, the fingers settling into the worn grooves that past seasons of use had shaped into the wood. The dweller dipped the brush into the whitewash, submerging the bristles only halfway to avoid overloading them, and then tapped the brush gently against the inside rim of the bucket to let the excess liquid run back down. A single heavy white drop fell into the bucket with a soft plop, and the brush came away evenly coated, its load glistening in the grey light. The first stroke was made on the uppermost panel of wattle, just where the daub curved in to meet the thatch. The dweller reached up with a steady arm and laid the brush against the wall, drawing it downward in a slow, controlled line. The whitewash, which had looked so creamy and opaque in the bucket, turned strangely grey and translucent as it touched the dark daub, a transformation so immediate that it always seemed a kind of small magic. The wet trail reflected the light from the doorway, a shimmering stripe that looked almost like water, and yet would dry to a solid white. The dweller watched the stroke for a moment, then lifted the brush and applied a second stroke directly beside the first, overlapping the edges slightly so that no dark line remained between them. A rhythm developed, as it always does with repetitive work that requires patience. The dweller moved the brush upward to the source, dipped it into the bucket, tapped it against the rim, and laid the whitewash onto the wall in a smooth downward stroke. Then another dip, another tap, and another stroke beside the last, each one roughly the width of the brush and as long as the arm could reach from the standing position. The dweller worked from the top down and from left to right across the back wall, covering the highest panels where the brush could reach and leaving the lower sections for later. The progress was slow, for the daub was absorbent and pulled the moisture from the whitewash quickly, meaning that each stroke had to be laid down with enough material to form a continuous film. The broad brush made a soft, wet sound against the wall, a sound that was not quite a swish and not quite a slap, but something in between, a muted, rhythmic whisper that filled the quiet cottage. The dweller's arm grew heavy after a time, and a pause was taken to rest it. The brush set across the rim of the bucket, with its bristles hanging inside to keep them moist. During the pause, the dweller stepped back to the center of the room and looked at the work so far. A pale greyish swath now covered the upper third of the back wall, its edges distinct against the still dark lower panels, and the whole room already seemed subtly altered by this single section of brightness. When the arm had rested, the dweller continued, now attending to the spaces between the crook beams. These were trickier, for the oak timbers jutted out from the plane of the daub and required the brush to be worked around their edges with some care. The dweller used the smaller brush here, dipping it into the bucket with a careful hand and applying the whitewash in shorter, more controlled strokes that traced the junction where wood met daub. The grain of the oak had been darkened by smoke, but was now, like the walls, to be whitened, and the lime wash flowed into the tiny cracks and crevices of the timber as the brush moved along it in the direction of the grain. The dweller had not forgotten the test patch behind the door, which had dried to a solid, chalky white, and now served as a small reminder of what the entire room would soon become. It was a reassuring sight, that dry white square, and the dweller glanced at it now and then while working, as if it stood for the finished task in miniature. The test patch also showed the slight texture that the whitewash would have, not perfectly smooth like paint, but with a fine gritty nap that caught the light in a soft, powdery way. The upper portion of the back wall took the better part of the morning, for the dweller worked with a deliberate slowness that valued evenness over speed. Each stroke of the brush was examined after it was laid, and any spots that appeared too thin or that showed the dark daub beneath were given a second light pass, just enough to fill the gap without building up too much material. The whitewash was forgiving in this way, able to be layered while still wet, and the dweller used this property to produce a surface that was consistent from one edge of the wall to the other. After the back wall's upper section was complete, the dweller cleaned the small brush in the clay bowl of water, working the bristles gently to remove the lime before it could harden, and then set it aside to dry. The bucket of whitewash was lifted and carried to the next wall, the one that contained the small unglazed window. The sacking was repositioned on the floor, and the dweller began again, dipping the broad brush and applying the whitewash to the area above and around the window opening. Here the work required additional care, for the window frame was made of rough-hewn alder that had warped slightly over time, and the whitewash had to be applied right up to the edge of the oiled linen cloth without touching the cloth itself. The dweller used the edge of the brush with a precise, delicate motion, one that had been practiced on many small household tasks over the years, and the whitewash went on cleanly, a neat border of greyish-white that framed the window. Through the open doorway, the grey light of the overcast day remained constant, neither brightening nor dimming, and the dweller worked within this steady illumination, without needing to adjust position. The autumn air, cool and slightly damp, drifted into the cottage and carried away the sharp lime scent, replacing it with the freshness of the fields and the distant smell of wood smoke from some other holding. The dweller paused now and then to drink from the clay cup, to stretch the neck and the shoulders, and to observe the quiet view of the hedgerow and the empty lane. The third and fourth walls followed in their turn, each receiving the same slow attention to their upper reaches. The wall behind the hearth was the most difficult, for the smoke-blackened stones of the fireplace jutted into the room and created a number of corners and edges that required the smaller brush. The dweller knelt on the folded sack to reach these areas, working the whitewash into the mortar joints and around the wooden mantel shelf that held the oil lamp and a few clay jars. The lime wash covered the old soot stains on the mortar, transforming them from black to a uniform pale grey as it dried. By the time the upper sections of all four walls had been coated, the day had advanced well into the afternoon, and the bucket of whitewash was noticeably lighter. The dweller examined the entire room from the centre, turning slowly to take in the new appearance, and observed that the dark upper corners of the cottage were gone now, replaced by a wet, greyish surface that would dry to white over the coming hours. The beams, too, were coated, their dark oak now hidden under a sleek, wet film that caught the light and made them look like sculpted stone rather than wood. The dweller's hands and forearms were dusted with a fine white powder that had dried on the skin, and there were a few small splashes on the toes of the leather shoes, but otherwise the work had been cleanly done. The bucket was carried outside and covered with a flat board to keep out insects and dust, and the brushes were rinsed thoroughly in the stream at the bottom of the field, the dweller walking down through the wet grass and kneeling at the water's edge to work the bristles free of all traces of lime. The cold water of the stream numbed the fingers slightly, but it was a fresh, clean feeling, and the dweller stayed there for a few extra moments, watching the water run over the brown pebbles. Back at the cottage, the dweller dried the brushes with a clean rag and hung them on their pegs near the door. The room was now a strange and transitional space, half dark and half glistening, the upper walls wet and grey, the lower walls still the pale brown of clean daub. The contrast was striking, and the dweller moved about the room with a quiet awareness of this division, noting how the light from the window and the doorway seemed to behave differently now, how it reflected off the wet whitewash in a way that made the whole upper half of the room feel as though it were gently lit from within. Supper that evening was a simple affair of barley and leeks, stewed together with a little salt, eaten while sitting on the covered stool in the centre of the room. The smell of drying lime mingled with the smell of the stew, a clean mineral note alongside the savoury warmth of the broth, and the dweller ate slowly, looking up often at the wet walls. The greyish colour was already beginning to pale at the edges, a sign that the drying had commenced, and the test patch behind the door had become a reference point for what the room would look like in the morning. When the light outside finally failed and the oil lamp was lit, its small flame reflected in 100 tiny points off the still damp whitewash, giving the upper room a gentle scattered glow that had not been there before. The dweller sat quietly for a time, doing nothing but observing this new quality of light, and a sense of quiet satisfaction, the same that had accompanied the successful mixing of the whitewash, settled into the room like a calm presence. The night was cool, and the dweller added a single log to the fire before retiring. The first coat would need to dry for at least 2 days, so there would be no whitewashing on the morrow, only the simple routines of the cottage and the patient observation of the walls as they transformed from wet to dry. The dweller lay down on the straw mattress with the wool blanket pulled high, and the last sight before sleep was the glimmer of the lamp on the whitewashed beams overhead, a soft white canopy where once there had been blackened oak and soot-dark mud. The cottage had begun its brightening, and the first most important step was complete. 2 days had passed since the first coat of whitewash was applied to the upper walls, and the cottage had settled into a quiet interim of drying. The dweller had used the time well, attending to the small tasks that always waited in the margins of the days, a thorough mucking of the hearth ash, the turning of the straw mattress, a long afternoon spent sharpening the iron knife on a smooth river stone. All the while the upper portions of the walls had dried from their wet grey into a soft, chalky white, and the dweller had observed the change with calm attention, noting how the colour evened out as the moisture left, how the slight streaks that had seemed visible on the first day had faded into a uniform matte surface by the second morning. Now it was time to begin the lower walls. The upper whitewash had dried firm and clean, a pale, uninterrupted band that ran around the top third of the room like a ring of lighter sky, and below it the old clean daub still waited. In its natural brown, the 2 zones divided by a slightly irregular line where the tall reach of the dweller's arm had ended. The bucket of whitewash, which had been stored outside under its flat board cover, was brought back in and stirred once more with the wooden spoon, its surface swirling smoothly without any sign of thickening or crusting, for the cool weather had kept it fresh. The work on the lower walls would require kneeling and crouching rather than standing and reaching, so the dweller prepared the folded sack as a cushion and set it on the floor near the back wall where the whitewashing would resume. The broad brush was taken from its peg, its bristles still soft and pliable from the thorough rinsing 2 days before, and the small brush was laid nearby in case the edges around the floor and the hearth needed finer attention. A second cloth was tucked into the dweller's belt for wiping away any accidental drips that might fall on the packed earth floor. Kneeling on the sack, the dweller began where the dried whitewash ended, and the brown daub began, applying the first downward stroke that bridged the 2 zones. The new wet wash overlapped the dry edge of the old coat by the width of a finger, a deliberate overlap that would prevent any dark seam from appearing when both layers were fully dry. The lime wash went onto the lower daub just as it had onto the upper, turning greyish and translucent on contact, and the dweller watched the wet edge merge with the dry white above it, a seamless joining that promised an even finish. The lower portions of the wall had a different character than the upper ones, for they had been less exposed to smoke, but more exposed to the daily life of the cottage. Here the daub was marked with the faint scuffs of shoulders brushing past, the occasional small dent from a shifted piece of furniture, the subtle darkening where hands had rested against the wall while rising from the stool. The whitewash covered all of these marks evenly, erasing the minor history of use that had been written on the surface, and as the dweller moved along the wall, a fresh, clean surface grew behind the brush, like a new page being laid over an old one. The work proceeded along the back wall from one corner to the other, the dweller shifting the sack along every few feet, so that the knees always had cushioning. The strokes were the same steady downward motions that had been used for the upper walls, dip and tap and stroke, a rhythm that had become familiar now, and that the hands performed without much conscious direction. The mind was free to wander in the quiet way that repetitive work allows, drifting across small memories of other autumns, other tasks done in this same cottage, the faces of neighbours seen at the market but not spoken of now, only held gently in the background of thought. When the back wall's lower section was complete, the dweller rose from the sack and stretched the legs, which had grown stiff from the kneeling. A cup of water was poured from the clay pitcher, and the dweller stood in the doorway looking out at the bare fields while drinking, the cold water a small clarity in the mouth. The day was again grey and still, the clouds a single unbroken layer from horizon to horizon, the sort of day that had no hours marked except by the slow change of light. A few crows moved across the far hedge, black shapes against the pale sky, and then they too were gone. The next wall was the one with the small window, and it presented the first true nook of the day's work. The window opening was a simple, unglazed rectangle cut into the wattle frame, about the size of a spread hand, with an oiled linen cloth stretched over it on a light alder frame that could be pushed aside during the day. The dweller had been careful when whitewashing the upper area around the window, and now the lower area required even more precision, for the whitewash had to be applied up to the very edge of the opening without getting any on the linen cloth, which would stiffen and yellow if touched by the lime. The dweller used the small brush for this delicate work, dipping only the very tip of the bristles into the whitewash and applying it in short, controlled strokes that traced the bottom edge of the window frame. The alder wood of the frame was rough and slightly splintered, and the brush had to be worked into the tiny irregularities with a patient, dabbing motion. The dweller's free hand rested against the wall for steadiness, and the face was brought close to the work, so close that the clean mineral smell of the lime was strong in the nostrils. When the border around the window was complete, a neat white frame now surrounded the pale square of linen, and the dweller sat back on the heels to inspect it, finding the line clean and true. The wall with the door came next, though only a narrow strip of daub existed between the door frame and the corner of the cottage. This strip of wall had been a dark, shadowed crevice for as long as the dweller could remember, a place where dust gathered and where the broom could barely reach, and whitewashing it felt like lighting a small candle in a forgotten corner. The dweller worked the brush into this narrow space with short vertical strokes. The handle held at an angle to fit, and the greyish wet lime seemed to push back the shadows even before it dried, the surface already reflecting more of the thin daylight. The fourth wall, the one that held the hearth, was the most complex of the lower sections. The hearth was a broad stone structure that jutted out into the room, with a raised stone ledge for cooking pots and a deep firebox lined with soot-blackened clay. The whitewashing here had to be done carefully around the irregular edges of the stones, where the daub met the masonry in a joint that had been filled with clay and was now, after years of heating and cooling, slightly cracked and uneven. The dweller began by whitewashing the door panels on either side of the hearth, broad surfaces that accepted the brush easily, and then turned attention to the edge where the wall met the stone. The joint between daub and hearth was a narrow wavering line that required the small brush and a steady hand. The dweller followed this line with the patience of someone who understood that the details mattered as much as the broad expanses, that the eye would always find the edges and judge the work by them. The whitewash was applied right up to the stone, a thin, even line that defined the boundary cleanly, and any small drips that fell onto the stone were immediately wiped away with the cloth from the belt, for the dweller had no wish to whiten the grey hearthstones themselves. The wooden shelf that served as the mantel was another challenge, for it was fixed to the wall with 2 pegs and had to be worked around on 3 sides. The dweller used the small brush to trace the underside of the shelf and the spaces between the pegs, and then the broad brush to whitewash the wall above the shelf, connecting the lower fresh coat with the dried upper whitewash. The oil lamp that usually sat on the shelf had been moved to the table in the center of the room, and the few clay jars had been set on the floor, so the shelf was bare and accessible. Beneath the shelf, tucked into the corner where the hearth wall met the side wall, there was a small nook where the dweller kept a bundle of dried kindling and a spare oil jug. This corner had been dark for so long that it seemed to absorb light rather than return it, and the dweller had to bring the oil lamp over to see properly while whitewashing the angled surfaces. The brush worked into the corner with short, careful strokes, and the whitewash seemed almost to glow in the lamplight, a promise of the brightness that would come when the whole room was finished and the lamp was returned to its shelf. The other nook in the cottage was behind the door, the same area where the test patch had been made days earlier. This small recess, formed by the door frame and the corner of the back wall, held a single wooden peg, from which hung a spare woolen cloak. The dweller lifted the cloak away and set it on the bed frame, then whitewashed the recess with the same care given to all the other hidden spaces. The test patch was now surrounded by fresh, wet whitewash on all sides, its dry, corky surface standing out against the grey wetness, and the dweller noted that the colour match would be perfect once everything had dried. The lower walls took the remainder of the morning and a portion of the early afternoon, for the dweller paused often to rest the knees and to let the hands recover from gripping the brush handles. A midday meal of cold bread and soft cheese was eaten while sitting outside on the wooden bench against the cottage wall, the grey sky overhead and the smell of wet lime drifting out through the open door. The dweller chewed slowly, watching a flock of starlings wheel over the distant field, their shape shifting and contracting like a single dark cloth shaken in the wind. When the meal was finished, the dweller returned inside and began the final portion of the lower work, the wall spaces around the wooden bed frame. The bed frame was a simple structure of oak planks, fixed to the wall on one side and supported by two stubby legs on the other, with a straw mattress and wool blankets and a daytime roll at the foot. The area behind and beneath the bed frame had not been whitewashed during the other coat, for it was too low to reach without kneeling and too obstructed to brush freely. So the dweller now pulled the frame away from the wall as far as it would go, which was only a hand's span, but enough to admit the brush. Kneeling on the floor with the sack pushed to one side, the dweller reached the brush into the narrow gap behind the bed frame and applied the whitewash with awkward short strokes that had to be done mostly by feel. The lime wash coated the daub and the back of the bed plank alike, and the dweller accepted this, for a little whiteness on the unseen wood would do no harm. The wall behind the bed received its coat, and then the frame was eased back into place, its slight scraping against the wet lime leaving a mark that the dweller smoothed over with the edge of the spatula. With the bed frame area complete, the entirety of the lower walls had now received their first coat. The dweller stood in the center of the room, turning in a slow circle to survey the results, and saw that the cottage was now divided not into two zones, but into one continuous surface of wet greyish-white that covered every wall from the floor to the underside of the thatch. The transformation was striking, even in its unfinished state, for the room seemed to have grown in all dimensions, the walls pushing outward, the ceiling lifting, the corners releasing their stored shadows. The bucket of whitewash was nearly empty now, only a shallow inch remaining at the bottom, and the dweller scraped the last of it into a small clay jar that was sealed with a piece of oiled cloth, a reserve that might be needed for touching up thin spots after the second coat dried. The bucket was taken outside and rinsed, and the brushes were again carried down to the stream for a thorough cleaning, the cold water running milky with lime until the bristles released no more whiteness. Back at the cottage, the dweller hung the brushes to dry and set the rinsed bucket upside down against the wall. The floor was checked for drips, and a few small white spots were scraped up with the edge of the spatula, the packed earth beneath them slightly bleached where the lime had touched. The dweller then washed the hands and face at the bench, using a bit of wood ash to scrub away the dried white patches that had clung to the knuckles and the wrists. The afternoon light, which had been a steady grey all day, now began its slow decline toward evening, and the dweller moved the stool back to its place near the hearth and uncovered the table. The room, still wet and glistening, seemed to hold the fading daylight more generously than before, the whitewashed surfaces acting as a mirror for even the faintest glow from the window. The dweller sat on the stool and looked at the walls, knowing that the drying would take another 2 days and that the second coat would follow, but also knowing that the hardest part of the physical work was now done. Supper was a bowl of warm pottage made from dried peas and a small piece of salt pork, the broth thick and savoury, and the dweller ate it slowly while watching the walls begin their gradual change from grey toward white at the uppermost edges, where the air was warmest from the fire and the drying had already begun. The smell of lime, which had been strong during the application, was now fading into the background, joining the familiar scents of wood smoke and earth that were the cottage's constant companions. When the night came fully and the oil lamp was lit, the room glowed with a soft, diffuse light that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and the dweller sat for a long while in the quiet, watching the small flame reflect off the wet walls, the gentle flicker that made the whole room seem to breathe. The first coat was complete, and the cottage had taken its first full step toward the brightness that would carry it through the dark winter ahead. The first full day of drying began with a faint silver light that seeped through the oiled linen window covering and spread itself timidly across the newly whitewashed walls. The dweller woke to find the cottage already changed from the evening before, for the whitewash had continued its slow transformation through the night, the warmth of the banked hearth fire driving the moisture outward and upward. The walls, which had been a glistening grey at bedtime, were now a pale, powdery white at their tops, and still faintly damp and cool to the touch, lower down where the air was heavier and still. The dweller rose from the straw mattress and moved through the morning routines with a quiet attention to the room, not the focused attention of work, but the gentler awareness of someone observing a slow, natural process. The hearth fire was coaxed back from its embers, fresh wood added, and the small flames sent a flicker of orange light across the white surfaces that had not existed before the whitewashing. A dance of warmth that the old dark walls would have swallowed whole. Now the light played and returned, and the dweller paused with a poker in hand, simply watching the way the firelight moved across the matte whiteness. Breakfast was the same as most mornings, a bowl of oat porridge with a small drizzle of honey kept in a clay pot on the shelf, eaten while sitting on the stool in the center of the room. The dweller ate slowly, the wooden spoon rising and falling, and the gaze traveled across the walls with a calm, measuring quality. The difference between the wet and dry areas was visible now. The upper walls, which had been whitewashed 2 days earlier, were a uniform chalky white with a slight velvety texture that seemed to soften the edges of the room, while the lower walls, whitewashed only the day before, were still a light grey with darker patches near the floor where the moisture lingered longest. The first task of the day was not a task at all, but a waiting, and the dweller understood that waiting was as much a part of the whitewashing as the mixing and the brushing. The lime could not be hurried, for it cured through a slow chemical union with the air itself, pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and slowly returning to its original limestone nature, though now in a thin, even layer upon the walls rather than as a stone in the field. This process would take days, and the dweller had no intention of rushing it, knowing that a second coat applied too soon would trap moisture beneath and cause the whitewash to fail, flaking away in the spring when the damp rose. So the morning was given over to small, unhurried occupations that had been waiting for attention. A leather shoelace on the left shoe had frayed and threatened to break, and the dweller sat on the stool near the window where the light was best, threading a bone needle with waxed linen thread and stitching a new section onto the worn lace. The work required a close focus. The needle pushed through the tough leather with a steady pressure. The thread pulled tight and knotted, and the dweller's head was bent over the task while the walls continued their quiet drying all around. From time to time the dweller looked up from the mending and simply observed the room, noting the subtle changes as the morning advanced. The greyish dampness on the lower walls was receding upward, the line between wet and dry moving as slowly as the shadow of the sundial that stood outside the door, a gradual retreat that left behind a surface ever more opaque and white. The patch of wall nearest the hearth dried fastest, for the warmth of the fire drove the moisture out, and the dweller saw that this area had already achieved the same chalky whiteness as the upper walls. When the shoelace was mended and the shoe returned to the foot, the dweller took down the small sack of dried beans from the shelf and sat again on the stool to sort through them. The beans were from the summer garden, a mix of broad beans and small grey peas that had been dried on racks in the sun and stored for winter use, and the sorting was necessary because a few had spoiled or been nibbled by mice. The dweller spread a cloth on the floor, poured out a measure of beans, and began to pick through them one by one, separating the sound from the withered, the smooth from the cracked. It was slow, repetitive work that required little thought, and the mind floated free while the hands moved, the white walls surrounding the task like a calm, blank canvas. The light changed as midday approached, and the dweller noticed that the room now seemed to hold its brightness longer than before. The small window, which had always cast a pale rectangle on the floor that faded quickly into the gloom, now produced a patch of light that seemed to spread outward from its edges, reflecting off the whitewashed walls and filling the corners with a soft, diffuse glow. The dweller could see the grain of the table more clearly, could distinguish the different colors in the clay jars on the shelf, could even read the small cracks in the hearthstones that had been invisible in the old dimness. This new brightness was not dramatic or startling, but modest and steady, the kind of change that accumulated in the noticing rather than announcing itself all at once. The dweller thought about the dark winter days to come, when the sun would rise late and set early, and the sky would be a low grey lid for weeks on end, and understood that this small gain in reflected light would make a genuine difference to the experience of those long hours. A room that returned the light rather than drinking it down would be a room that felt less confined, less pressed upon by the weight of the season. The sorting of the beans took most of the afternoon, for the dweller worked slowly and paused often. When the task was complete, The good beans were poured into a clean clay crock and sealed with a wooden lid, and the spoiled ones were collected in a small basket to be scattered for the birds. The dweller rose and stretched, then walked a slow circuit of the room, trailing a hand lightly over the surface of the walls to test their dryness. The upper walls were completely dry to the touch, with a fine, slightly gritty texture that came away as the faintest white dust on the fingertips. The lower walls were drier than they had been in the morning, but still cool and ever so slightly damp at the very base where the daub met the earth floor. During this circuit, the dweller noted a few thin patches where the old dark daub showed faintly through the dried whitewash. These were not flaws in the work, but simply areas where the absorbent daub had pulled in more of the lime wash than elsewhere, leaving a slightly translucent film that allowed a hint of the brown substrate to remain visible. The dweller marked these spots in memory, noting their locations, one near the corner of the back wall, another beside the door frame, a third on the panel to the right of the hearth. These would receive extra attention during the second coat, a slightly heavier application that would build the opacity to match the rest of the walls. The afternoon faded into evening with the same slow grey stillness that had marked the previous days, and the dweller lit the oil lamp as the natural light diminished. The lamp flame, small as it was, now produced a remarkable effect, for its light bounced from the white walls and created a sphere of warm visibility that encompassed nearly the entire room. Before the whitewashing, the lamp had pushed back only a small circle of darkness, leaving the corners and the upper reaches in deep shadow. But now, the whole cottage seemed to gather around the flame like a family around a table, intimate and close and fully present. The dweller prepared a simple supper of bread soaked in warm broth, eating from a wooden bowl while sitting on the stool, and watched the play of lamplight on the walls without any need to do or think anything more. The thin patches noted earlier were invisible in the low light, and the room appeared perfectly uniform. A soft white shell that enclosed the small domestic world of the hearth and the bed and the table. The smell of drying lime had faded to almost nothing, replaced by the familiar smells of wood smoke and bread and the faint earthiness of the packed floor. The second day of drying began much like the first, with a pale grey light at the window and the walls a shade whiter than they had been the evening before. The dweller rose and moved through the morning rituals with the same quiet attention, noting that the lower walls were now entirely dry, except for a few small patches directly behind the bed frame where the air could not circulate freely. These patches were left uncovered, the bed frame pulled away slightly to let them breathe, and the dweller knew they would be dry by evening. The day's occupations were equally modest. The dweller spent an hour outside cutting back the dead stems of the herb patch near the cottage wall, gathering the dried leaves of sage and rosemary and tying them into small bundles that were hung from the rafters to dry further. The air outside was cool and still, the ground soft with recent rain, and the dweller worked with a gentle pace that matched the quiet of the landscape. The fields were empty, the hedgerows bare, and the only sound was the occasional call of a distant crow or the rustle of the dead herb stems as they were gathered. Back inside, the dweller took down the woolen shawl that had been worn during the kiln tending and found a small moth hole near the hem. The repair was done with the same bone needle and waxed thread, a careful darning that pulled the loose fibers together and closed the hole without a seam. The dweller sat near the window for the best light, and the white walls reflected that light onto the work, making it easier to see the individual threads and to guide the needle through the wall. Throughout the day, the dweller continued the quiet observation of the walls, noting how the last traces of grey disappeared, how the surface grew ever more uniformly white, how the subtle differences in texture between the door panels and the oak beams became more apparent now that both were the same colour. The beams, which had seemed so dark before, were now smooth white forms that curved up from the floor and met the thatch, their grain hidden, but their shape more visible than ever, like the bones of the cottage made manifest. By the evening of the second drying day, the first coat was fully cured, and the room had reached a stable state of whiteness that would serve as the foundation for the second coat. The thin patches remained, faint shadows on the white, and the dweller looked at them with calm acceptance, knowing that they were not failures but signs of where more attention was needed. The mental list that had been kept during the observations was now complete, and the dweller felt a quiet readiness to begin the next stage. The night came, and the dweller lit the oil lamp and sat for a while in the completed whiteness of the first coat, feeling the room as it now was, and imagining it as it would be after the second and perhaps a third application. The difference between the old dark cottage and the present one was already profound, and yet the dweller understood that the process was not finished, that the true depth and evenness of a proper whitewashing came only with the second coat, which would fill the minute pores and build the surface to its final opacity. With these thoughts circling slowly, the dweller banked the fire and lay down on the straw mattress, the white walls all around, the faint smell of clean lime lingering as a memory, and the quiet knowledge that tomorrow the brush would be lifted again and the work would continue toward its calm and unhurried completion. On the morning chosen for the second coat, the dweller woke to a sky that had cleared at last, with a high, pale sun shining through the window and casting a neat white rectangle on the floorboards. The first coat had dried for 2 full days and was now a uniform chalky white, though the few thin patches noted earlier still showed as faint shadows beneath the surface, areas where the dark daub seemed to breathe through the lime. The dweller rose, folded the wool blanket, and prepared the cottage for the day's work with the same methodical calm that had accompanied the first application. A fresh bucket of whitewash was needed, and the dweller set about mixing it exactly as before, following the same recipe that had proven itself true. The remaining lime putty, which had been kept sealed under a damp cloth since the first mixing, was brought out from its corner and stirred gently with the hazel pole. Its surface had firmed slightly during the days of waiting, but a few turns of the pole restored its smooth, buttery consistency. Water was added in small amounts from the well bucket, the dweller pouring slowly and stirring continuously, watching the putty loosen into heavy cream and then into a liquid that clung to the pole and dripped in slow white drops. A measured handful of coarse sea salt was dissolved in a cup of warm water and poured into the mixture, the salt crystals vanishing as the pole stirred them through, and the whole bucket was strained a final time through the linen cloth to catch any tiny lumps. The whitewash was ready, as white and smooth as the first batch had been. The dweller decided to work from bottom to top this time, a reversal of the first coat that would allow the new layer to be feathered into the already dry upper sections without leaving a visible overlap line. The folded sack was placed on the floor near the back wall, and the dweller knelt upon it with a broad brush in hand, dipping the bristles into the fresh whitewash and tapping the excess against the bucket's inner rim. The first stroke of the second coat was laid at the base of the wall, where the daub met the packed earth floor, and the dweller drew the brush upward in a smooth, even motion that ended where the first coat began. The sensation of the brush on the already whitened surface was different from the first application, and the dweller noticed this immediately. Where the bare daub had pulled the moisture from the brush with a slight drag, the lime-washed surface received the fresh whitewash with a smooth, gliding ease, almost as if the wall itself were helping to spread the liquid evenly. The brush required less pressure, and the whitewash flowed from the bristles in a thin, consistent film that covered the surface without pooling or running. The dweller adjusted to this new feeling, letting the brush do more of the work, and the strokes became longer and more fluid, each one overlapping the edge of the previous by the width of a thumb. Working upward from the floor, the dweller moved along the back wall in a series of vertical bands, each one reaching from the base to slightly above the midpoint, where the dried first coat waited. The new wet whitewash merged with the old dry surface at the top of each stroke, the greyish wetness darkening the white and then lightening again as the moisture equalized. The dweller paused often to observe this merging, checking that no hard line was forming, that the transition between coats was gradual and seamless. When a faint ridge did appear, the dweller used the tip of the brush to feather it out with a few light, horizontal strokes that blurred the boundary. The lower walls, which had been the last to receive the first coat, now received the second coat with a particular thoroughness, for the dweller remembered the thin patches that had been catalogued during the drying days. At the corner of the back wall where the old daub had shown through, the brush was loaded slightly more heavily, and the whitewash was worked into the surface with a gentle circular motion that filled the porous spots. Beside the door frame, another thin area was treated the same way, the dweller kneeling close and applying the brush with a focused attention, watching the greyish layer settle into the faint depression and promise a deeper opacity when dry. The third thin patch near the hearth was also addressed, the brush moving in careful spirals until the surface looked uniform with the surrounding areas. The work on the lower walls proceeded around the room in the same order as before, from the back wall to the window wall, then to the door wall, and finally to the hearth wall. The nooks that had required such careful attention during the first coat were easier now, for the white surfaces reflected light into their own recesses, making it simpler to see where the brush had been and where it still needed to go. The dweller knelt by the narrow gap behind the bed frame, reached the brush into the tight space, and applied the second coat with short, efficient strokes that covered the first coat completely, and whitened the hidden daub until it matched the rest of the room. When the lower walls were done, and the dweller rose to stretch the knees, the morning had advanced into early afternoon, and the cottage was filled with the clean, mineral smell of fresh lime. The lower half of each wall was now a wet grey that would dry to white over the coming hours, while the upper half remained the dry, chalky white of the first coat, and the two zones were separated by a faint, irregular line where the overlapping had occurred. The dweller looked at this line with a calm satisfaction, knowing that it would disappear entirely as the moisture equalized and the drying progressed. The second coat on the upper walls followed, for the dweller had decided to cover the entire room again rather than only the lower portions, since a consistent thickness across all surfaces would produce the most even finish. The stool was brought to the center of the room, and the dweller stood upon it to reach the highest panels just beneath the thatch, where the first coat had been applied with an upward stretch. Now the brush moved over these high areas with the same smooth glide that had characterized the lower work, the already whitened daub accepting the fresh layer easily, and the dweller worked from the top downward in long, overlapping strokes that met the rising strokes from below and merged into a seamless whole. The timbers received their second coat with the same methodical care, the brush moving along the oak beams in the direction of the grain, filling the tiny cracks and crevices that the first coat had only partially covered. The wet white clung to the rounded surfaces of the beams without dripping, for the lime had been mixed the right consistency, thick enough to hold but thin enough to spread, and the dweller noted with quiet satisfaction that the beams were now becoming truly white rather than merely pale. The dark oak was thoroughly hidden, its grain and color sealed under a smooth, continuous layer that would cure to a soft, matte finish. A discovery was made as the second coat progressed, the lime covered with such willingness that the dweller could use less material than before. The first coat had required a certain loading of the brush to achieve a solid film, but the second coat needed only a moderate amount, as though the wall itself were now less thirsty, its absorptive capacity already satisfied by the earlier application. The bucket of whitewash diminished more slowly, and by the time the entire room had received its second coat, there was still a generous quantity remaining, enough for a third thin application if the dry results suggested it was needed. The afternoon was given over to drying once more, and the dweller spent the waiting hours in quiet, patient observation. The fire was kept burning gently to warm the room and speed the curing, and the dweller sat on the stool watching the walls change from wet grey to pale white, a transition that seemed faster this time, perhaps because the underlying surface was already white and the wet layer dried from both above and below. The thin patches from the first coat were no longer visible, even in the wet state, and the dweller felt a growing confidence that the second coat had achieved the even opacity that had been the goal from the beginning. By evening, the second coat was dry enough to touch, though still slightly cool against the fingertips, and the dweller walked a slow circuit of the room, examining the walls under the light of the oil lamp. The whiteness was deeper now, less translucent, with a faint richness that the first coat had not possessed, a quality that came from the layering of lime over lime. The surface was smooth and even, without streaks or brush marks, and the few imperfections of the first coat had been completely covered. Yet as the dweller studied the walls in the flickering lamplight, a thought arose, quiet and unbidden. A third coat applied very thinly might lift the whiteness from merely good to truly luminous, giving the room a depth of brightness that would last through the long dark months. The decision was made without hurry during the course of the next morning, after the second coat had fully dried and the dweller had examined it in the clear light of day. The walls were white and even, but there was a subtle quality, almost a translucence at certain angles, that suggested the lime could be built up just a little further. The leftover whitewash sat in its bucket, still fresh under its cloth cover, and there was enough for exactly this purpose, a thin, final veil that would add the last measure of opacity without requiring a full heavy coat. So on the third afternoon, with the sun slanting through the window and the cottage quiet and warm, the dweller mixed a small additional amount of whitewash to supplement the leftover batch and began the third coat. This time the brush was loaded very lightly, the bristles merely dampened with the lime wash rather than saturated, and the strokes were swift and feather-light, sweeping over the walls like a painter applying a final glaze. The whitewash went on almost translucent, a milky film that barely darkened the surface beneath, and the dweller worked quickly, covering each wall with long horizontal strokes that crossed the vertical grain of the earlier coats and created a subtle interlacing of texture. The third coat dried almost as soon as it was applied, for it was so thin that the moisture evaporated within minutes, and the dweller watched the walls return to whiteness with a slight difference that was hard to name, but easy to see. The surface now had a very faint gloss in certain lights, a soft sheen that appeared when the dweller stood at a particular angle to the window, and then vanished when viewed straight on. The finish was still matte overall, but that occasional glint, that gentle luminosity, gave the walls a depth that they had not possessed before, as though the whiteness were no longer a surface but a space into which the eye could travel. The dweller stepped back to the center of the room and turned slowly, taking in the completed work. The walls rose from the floor to the thatch in a continuous, unbroken whiteness that made the cottage feel both larger and more intimate, a calm, bright shell that enclosed the small domestic world with a quiet, protective grace. The oak beams, now white and smooth, curved up from the corners like the ribs of a clean-bleached bone, and the dweller's shadow, when it fell across the timber frame, moved with a clarity that had not existed before, the edge of the shadow sharp and distinct against the pale background. All buckets were now empty, and the dweller carried them outside to be rinsed, along with the brushes and the hazel pole. The rinsing was done at the well rather than the stream, for the well was closer and the afternoon was advancing, and the dweller poured the cold water into the buckets slowly, swirling it around to loosen the last traces of lime. The whitewash left a thin, milky residue that was poured onto the roots of the old hazel bush, where it would sweeten the soil and do no harm, and the buckets were scrubbed with a handful of dry grass until the wood was clean and smooth to the touch. The brushes were washed with particular care, the bristles worked between the fingers under running water, until they released no more white, and then they were hung on their pegs near the door to dry in the gentle air. Back inside, the cottage smelled of clean lime and wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of the dried herbs hung from the rafters, and the dweller stood for a long moment in the quiet, looking at the walls that had been 3 times covered, and were now as bright as the dweller had imagined them during the autumn days, of gathering stone and building the kiln. The work was complete, the transformation achieved, and the room seemed to hold the afternoon light like a cup holds water, full and still and perfectly at peace. The dweller washed the hands and face at the bench, put away the tools, and sat on the stool to rest, knowing that the cottage was ready for the dark winter, and that the whiteness would remain as a quiet companion through all the cold months to come. November arrived without ceremony, bringing a low, flat sky the color of unwashed wool, and a stillness in the air that seemed to hold the whole countryside in a quiet pause. The dweller had lived with the newly whitewashed walls for several weeks now, and the brightness that had first seemed so remarkable had settled into the ordinary fabric of the days, not fading but becoming familiar, like a new chair that gradually accepts the shape of the body and no longer draws attention to itself. The walls were simply there, pale and clean, doing their quiet work of returning whatever light the season offered. Each morning now began in a room that felt, even on the darkest days, gently luminous. The first grey hint of dawn would seep through the oiled linen window covering and spread across the white surface of the opposite wall, and the dweller, rising from the straw mattress, would see the room whole and clear rather than in the fragmentary patches of the old dark cottage. The beams overhead, once blackened and heavy, now floated as pale arches, and the corners of the room which had always held a suggestion of depth beyond the reach of the eye were now plainly visible, their edges traced in the soft, chalky white that covered the daub and the oak alike. The morning rituals proceeded in this new clarity, with a quiet ease that the dweller had come to appreciate. The hearth fire was coaxed from its banked embers, and the small flames, instead of being swallowed by the dark walls as they had been in previous winters, now danced visibly across the white surfaces, sending their orange flicker into every corner. The dweller could see the pot of porridge warming on its iron trivet, could see the steam rise from the bubbling oats and drift upward until it vanished near the thatch, and could see the wooden spoon resting on its clay rest, with the grain of the handle distinct and readable in the combined light of the fire in the window. Preparing breakfast was a task that had once required a certain squinting attention, a bending close to the work, but now the dweller moved through it with the ease of full sight. The oats were measured from the crock with a wooden scoop, the water added from the pail, the salt pinched from the small clay pot, all without fumbling or peering, and the dweller stirred the pot with a slow circular motion while looking around the room rather than concentrating entirely on the porridge. The white walls seemed to hold the light and spread it evenly, so that the table, the stool, the shelf with its few jars, and the hearth with its cooking gear were all illuminated to the same gentle degree, a soft, democratic brightness that asked nothing in return. After breakfast, eaten from the wooden bowl while sitting on the stool, the dweller attended to the fire. The feeding of the hearth was a constant rhythm in the cold months, a slow pulse of logs added and ashes removed, and the dweller performed these actions with the familiar economy of movement that came from years of practice. A log of split birch was taken from the stack beside the hearth, its bark curling away in papery strips, and laid across the burning embers with a pair of iron tongs. The fire accepted it with a soft crackling and a fresh surge of flame, and the dweller watched the new light leap across the white walls, momentarily brightening the entire room before settling into a steady glow. The ash that had accumulated beneath the grate was raked into a small pile with a flat iron shovel, collected in a wooden bucket, and carried outside to be spread on the garden patch where it would sweeten the soil for the spring planting. The walk to the garden was brief, a few steps from the door across the packed earth of the yard, and the dweller paused there each morning to look at the sky and the bare fields, to feel the temperature of the air and gauge the likelihood of rain. On this particular November morning, the sky was a uniform soft grey from horizon to horizon, and the air was cool but not biting, with a faint smell of damp earth and fallen leaves. The dweller scattered the ash in a wide arc, watched the grey powder settle onto the dark soil, and then returned inside, closing the door against the chill. Back in the cottage, the room welcomed with its quiet brightness, a difference from outside that was not dramatic, but was nevertheless real and comforting. The dweller took down a bundle of wool from the shelf, a mass of raw fleece that had been sheared in the spring and washed in the stream, and began the slow process of teasing it apart in preparation for spinning. This was work that required good light, for the wool was pale grey and full of fine tangles that had to be picked out by hand, and the old dark cottage had made it a strain. Now the dweller sat on the stool near the window, where the light fell strongest, and worked at the wool with a pair of smooth wooden cards, brushing the fibres back and forth until they separated into a soft, airy cloud. The cards made a quiet, rhythmic sound as they pulled against each other, a soft thwick thwick that joined the crackle of the fire and the occasional distant call of rooks from the bare elms near the stream. The dweller worked slowly, pulling the teased wool into a long, loose rowlag that was then coiled into a basket, ready for the spinning wheel that sat in the corner by the bed frame. The white walls around the task seemed to concentrate the daylight, and the pale grey wool was easy to see against the dark wood of the cards, each tiny knot and burr clearly visible and easily removed. When the wool was teased and the basket was full, the dweller moved to the spinning wheel, a simple upright construction of oak that had been built by a local wheelwright many years before. The wheel was turned by a foot treadle, and the dweller settled onto the low stool before it, fitting a rowlag of wool onto the distaff and drawing the fibres out into a thin, even thread. The wheel began to turn with a steady hum, the spindle whirling, and the dweller's hands moved in the familiar dance of drafting and winding, the thread feeding onto the bobbin in a smooth, continuous line. The light from the window fell across the spinning wheel in a pale band, catching the turning spokes and making them flicker, and the white walls returned a soft, diffuse glow that filled in the shadows where the wheel's hub might otherwise have been dark and obscure. The dweller spun for an hour or more, the thread accumulating on the bobbin, the treadle rising and falling with a gentle rocking rhythm that was almost hypnotic. The mind, freed by the repetitive motion, drifted across small thoughts, the hens that had stopped laying as the days shortened, the need to check the thatch for leaks before the winter storms, the quiet satisfaction of the white walls, and how much easier it was to see the fine thread against their pale surface. By midday, The light outside had brightened slightly, the clouds thinning for a brief hour to let a watery sun shine through. The dweller stopped spinning and ate a simple meal of bread and hard cheese, eating standing by the window and looking out at the fields that stretched away into the grey distance. The patch of sun moved across the floor, a pale gold rectangle that shifted slowly toward the hearth, and the dweller watched it travel, noting how it caught the texture of the packed earth and the small irregularities of the floor, things that had always been there but had never before been so clearly seen. In the old cottage before the whitewashing, a patch of sun on the floor had been a bright island in a sea of dimness, and anything beyond its borders had vanished into shadow. Now the white walls caught that same sun and scattered it sideways, so that even the area around the door and the corner behind the spinning wheel remained legible, the objects there softly lit and identifiable. The dweller could see the shape of the broom leaning in its corner, the handle of the spade propped against the wall, the curve of the water pail with its lid of oiled cloth, and this visibility felt like a quiet generosity, a small gift that asked no thanks. The afternoon brought the cloud cover back, the sun vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared, and the room settled into its steady grey illumination once more. The dweller took up the mending of a linen tunic that had a tear in the side seam, sitting on the stool with the fabric spread across the lap and the bone needle working in and out with small precise stitches. The linen was a pale tan colour, and the thread was white, and the dweller could see the difference clearly, could see where the needle should go in and where it should come out, without straining the eyes or holding the work close to the fire. This was the true measure of the whitewashing, the dweller thought while stitching, not a dramatic transformation that announced itself with fanfare, but a quiet, practical improvement that touched every small task of the day. The porridge cooked without squinting, the wool was teased without eye strain, the spinning was done with clean sight, the mending was exact and easy, and the dark winter evenings that were now arriving earlier each day would be lit by both the fire and the walls. The flames reflected and multiplied until the whole room shared in the glow. As if to prove this thought, the afternoon began its slow decline into dusk, and the dweller set the mending aside and prepared for the evening. The fire was built up with a good log of applewood that would burn long and steady and give off a sweet scent, and the oil lamp was lit from the hearth flame and placed on the wooden shelf where its small circle of light, caught and returned by the white walls, seemed to expand until it filled the room. The dweller could see the grain of the table from across the cottage, could see the warp and weft of the linen cloth that covered the bread on its board, could see the beans in their clay pot on the shelf, and the individual twigs in the besom broom in the corner. The evening meal was a thick soup of dried beans and leeks, the last of the leeks from the garden patch, simmered slowly with a bit of salt pork and a handful of barley. The dweller ate from a deep wooden bowl, the steam rising from the broth and catching the lamplight, and the taste of the soup was hearty and good. While eating, the dweller looked around the room with a quiet, unhurried attention, not evaluating or judging, simply seeing. The white walls had been a project of weeks, from the gathering of the limestone to the final thin coat, and now they were simply part of the cottage, doing their work without effort or complaint. After the meal, the bowl was rinsed with a little water from the pail and set aside, and the dweller sat on the stool near the fire, drawing the woolen shawl closer around the shoulders as the evening chill crept in. The first cold rain of November began to tap against the thatch, a soft, scattered sound that started as a few isolated drops and then thickened into a steady patter. The rain was not heavy, not a storm, but a long, slow soaking that would fill the ditches and soften the paths and bring the last of the leaves down from the hedgerows. The dweller listened to the rain with a deep sense of comfort, for the cottage was dry and warm, the fire burned brightly, and the white walls stood all around, holding the light and returning it gently. The rain would fall for hours, perhaps all night, and the dweller would sleep with its steady rhythm overhead, knowing that the roof was sound and the walls were whole and the small world of the cottage was in order. It was wood for the fire, food in the crocks, wool for spinning, and the quiet pride of work well done. As the evening deepened, the dweller took up a small task that could be done by firelight, the polishing of a wooden spoon that had grown rough with use. A piece of fine sand-rubbed stone was taken from the shelf, and the dweller worked it gently over the bowl of the spoon and along the handle, smoothing away the small scratches and the raised grain. The work was slow and meditative, the stone moving in small circles, and the dweller paused often to feel the wood with a thumb, testing its smoothness, before continuing. The white walls surrounding this small task seemed almost to lean in, as if listening, their pale surfaces softened by the firelight into a warm cream color that was gentler than the stark white of midday. The dweller thought about the months ahead, about the deep winter that would arrive with its short days and long nights, about the snow that might come and the wind that would howl around the eaves, and felt not anxiety, but a quiet readiness. The cottage was prepared, its walls bright and clean, its stores full, its hearth strong, and that was as much as any person could ask. When the spoon was smooth and the stone was put away, the dweller sat for a while longer, doing nothing at all, simply being present in the room as the rain fell and the fire murmured. The light from the flames moved across the white walls in slow shifting patterns, and the dweller watched these without thought, letting the mind rest in the way that the body rests after a day of gentle labor. The cottage was quiet. The only sounds the rain and the fire, and the occasional settling of a log in the hearth, and the dweller felt a profound and wordless peace. At last the hour for sleep arrived, and the dweller rose from the stool, banked the fire with ash so that the embers would keep until morning, and walked a last slow circuit of the room before retiring. The white walls were dim now, lit only by the faint glow of the banked fire and the soft blue-grey light that seeped through the window from the overcast night sky. The dweller touched the nearest wall with a fingertip, feeling the familiar, slightly gritty texture of the dried lime, cool and firm, and let the hand rest there for a moment before turning to the bed frame. The straw mattress was soft and welcoming, the wool blanket heavy and warm, and the dweller lay down with a sigh that was not weariness but contentment. The rain continued to fall on the thatch overhead, a steady, lulling sound that had been the companion of sleep in this cottage for as many years as the dweller could remember, and the white walls stood all around in the darkness, invisible now but present, holding the memory of the day's light and waiting to return it with the dawn. The dweller closed the eyes and let the sound of the rain carry the mind away into the deep, quiet sleep that comes from a day lived slowly and a space made bright. The month of December came in on a wind that smelled of snow, though no snow fell for many days, and the dweller felt the season tighten toward the shortest day, with a slow, patient grip that made each morning a little darker and each evening a little longer. The whitewashed walls of the cottage had now been a part of the dweller's life for many weeks, and their brightness had become so integrated into the fabric of the room that it was no longer a thing to be noticed separately, but a quality of the space itself, like the scent of wood smoke or the sound of the wind under the eaves. The cottage had simply become a bright cottage, and the dweller moved through the dark days within its pale, calm shell with the unthinking ease of long familiarity. The sun, when it appeared at all, rose late and low over the bare hedgerows, casting a thin, watery light that slid across the fields and through the small window for only a few hours before retreating again. The dweller had grown accustomed to this brief arc of daylight and arranged the indoor tasks accordingly, doing the work that required the best illumination during the middle of the day and saving the simpler, more tactile occupations for the long twilit margins of morning and evening. The white walls helped, as they had done since the first coat dried, by catching what little sun there was and spreading it sideways into the darker parts of the room, a quiet, modest amplification that made the difference between a space that felt closed and one that felt open. On a morning in the second week of December, the dweller woke to find the world outside the window changed, for a thin layer of frost had settled over the fields during the night and now sparkled faintly under a high, pale sky. The cottage was cold, the fire having burned down to a bed of grey ash, and the dweller rose quickly to rebuild it, shivering slightly as the feet touched the packed earth floor. Kindling from the basket, a handful of dry bracken, a split log of birch, and then the careful blowing on the few remaining embers until a small flame caught and grew. The firelight reached the white walls and seemed to warm them, though the walls themselves were cold to the touch, and the dweller knelt before the hearth with the woolen shawl pulled tight, watching the flames establish themselves and waiting for the room to begin its slow warming. Breakfast was a bowl of barley porridge, the grains cooked long and slow until they were soft and swollen, with a pinch of salt and the last of the dried herbs from the bundle hung near the hearth. The dweller ate standing by the fire, the bowl held in both hands, and looked out through the small window at the frozen field and the distant line of bare trees along the stream. The world outside was still and silent, nothing moving but a single crow that flapped slowly across the grey sky and disappeared behind the thatch. The dweller finished the porridge, set the bowl aside, and settled into the rhythm of the short winter day. The tasks of deep winter were few and simple, for the gardens slept and the animals were few, and the social calls to neighbours were rare in the cold. The dweller spent the morning hours carding the last of the raw wool, the wooden cards moving back and forth with their soft, rhythmic sound, the pale grey fibres separating into a light, airy mass that was coiled into the basket for later spinning. The white walls reflected the grey light from the window onto the work, and the dweller could see every tangle, every small burr, every subtle variation in the colour of the wool as it passed between the cards. Spinning followed the carding as it always did, the wheel humming under the treadle, the thread forming between the dweller's fingers in a thin, even line that wound onto the bobbin. The motion was so familiar that the dweller's hands performed it without conscious direction, freeing the mind to drift across the quiet thoughts of winter, the stores of food remaining, the condition of the thatch, the small repairs that would need doing in the spring. These thoughts were not anxious but merely practical, a slow inventory that passed the time while the wheel turned and the fire crackled. The afternoon brought a change in the weather, the high pale sky thickening into a low grey blanket that seemed to press down on the landscape, and the light in the cottage dimmed correspondingly. The dweller added a log to the fire and lit the oil lamp, placing it on the wooden shelf where its small flame, multiplied by the white walls, created a warm sphere of visibility that filled the room. The spinning was put aside and the dweller took up the mending of a woolen tunic that had a warm patch at the elbow, sitting on the stool near the fire with the fabric across the lap and the bone needle moving in and out with small precise stitches. The lamp burned steadily, its wick trimmed that morning, and the dweller worked in its gentle light, the needle pulling the thread through the wool with a soft, repetitive sound. The white walls enclosed the small scene with a quiet, protective presence, their pale surfaces now warmed by the firelight into a soft cream colour that was more intimate than the stark white of midday. The dweller stitched and paused, the rhythm of the needle matching the rhythm of the fire, the two sounds weaving together into a single slow pulse that filled the dark afternoon. When the mending was complete and the tunic folded and set aside, the dweller prepared the evening meal, a thick soup of dried peas and a small piece of salt pork that had been stored in the crock since autumn. The soup was set to simmer over the fire in an iron pot, the dweller stirring it occasionally with the long wooden spoon that had been polished smooth weeks ago and that still retained its gentle sheen. The smell of the cooking peas mingled with the smell of the burning wood, and the clean, faint mineral scent that the lime walls still released when the air was damp. A complex and comforting blend that was the scent of winter in this cottage. As the soup cooked, the dweller sat on the stool and looked around the room with a quiet, reflective gaze. It had been many weeks since the gathering of the limestone, many weeks since the building of the little clamp kiln in the yard, and the memory of those autumn labours had softened into a pleasant, hazy sequence of images. The grey stones in the wicker basket, the smoke rising from the turf dome, the steam billowing from the turf dome, the steam billowing from the slaking trough, the brush moving in its slow rhythm across the dark daub. The dweller did not think of these things with any urgency or pride, but simply as events that had occurred, as natural as the turning of the leaves or the migration of the birds. The soup was ready when the peas were soft, and the broth had thickened, and the dweller ladled it into the deep wooden bowl and ate slowly, sitting on the stool with the bowl on the knees. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing coals, and the room was warm and dim, the only light coming from the lamp on the shelf and the soft red glow from the hearth. The white walls, which had been so triumphant in the daylight, now seemed to recede into a gentle supporting darkness, their brightness subdued but not extinguished, a quiet presence that waited for the return of the sun. The longest night of the year was approaching, the solstice that marked the turn of the season, and the dweller was aware of it in the same quiet way that the dweller was aware of all the old rhythms of the year. The shortening days and lengthening nights were not a cause for alarm, but simply the way of the world, and the cottage had been prepared for them with the whitewashing, the stocking of the crocks, the cutting and stacking of the firewood. All that was required now was to live through the dark weeks with patience and to wait for the light to return. On the evening of the solstice, which happened to be clear and bitterly cold with a sky full of hard, bright stars, the dweller built up the fire to an unusual height using a thick log of applewood that had been saved for just this occasion. The flames rose and danced, and the white walls caught their light and threw it back into the room, so that the whole cottage seemed to glow with a warm golden radiance. The dweller sat on the stool and watched the fire, feeling the heat on the face and hands, and thought about the turning of the year with a quiet, wordless acknowledgement. There was no ritual to mark the occasion, no special food or speech or gesture, only the heightened fire and the dweller's silent awareness that from this night forward the days would begin, very slowly and almost imperceptibly, to lengthen. The white walls stood around this thought like witnesses, their pale surfaces flickering with the firelight, and the dweller felt a connection to all the winters that had been spent in this cottage, and all the dwellers who had watched the same solstice fires and waited, as the present dweller waited, for the return of the sun. The fire eventually burned down, and the dweller banked the coals with ash and prepared for sleep. The oil lamp was extinguished, and the room fell into a deep, soft darkness that was complete except for the faint orange glow at the edge of the hearth. The dweller lay on the straw mattress with the wool blanket pulled up to the chin and looked toward the window, where the cold starlight pressed against the oiled linen, a pale blue-grey rectangle that was just barely visible against the surrounding black. In that darkness, the white walls were invisible, and yet the dweller knew they were there, could feel their presence in the quality of the darkness itself, which was less heavy and oppressive than the old dark had been. The memory of whiteness, the knowledge that the walls were bright even when the eyes could not see them, gave the room a different feeling, a sense of latent light that waited to be released with the morning. The dweller closed the eyes and let this feeling settle over the mind like a second blanket. The weeks that followed the solstice were the coldest of the year, and the dweller spent most of the time indoors, keeping the fire burning and tending to the small necessary tasks. The spinning continued, the yarn accumulating on the bobbins until there was enough to begin the knitting of a new pair of stockings, a slow process that occupied many evenings by the fire. The white walls watched over all of this work with their steady, silent presence, and the dweller sometimes touched them in passing, feeling the cool, slightly gritty surface that had been made from stone and fire and water and salt. The snow finally came in January, a heavy, quiet fall that began in the night and continued through the next day, blanketing the fields and the hedgerows and the thatch of the cottage in a thick layer of white. The dweller woke to find the light through the window strangely bright and diffuse, and opening the door revealed a world transformed, every familiar shape softened and rounded, every colour erased. The snow was a whiteness that matched the walls of the cottage, and the dweller stood in the doorway for a long time, looking out at the silent, monochrome landscape and feeling a kinship between the interior and the exterior that had not existed before. Shoveling a path to the well and to the wood pile was the necessary work of that snowy day, and the dweller did it with the old wooden spade, lifting the snow in careful scoops and piling it to one side. The cold was sharp and clean, and the dweller's breath plumed in the air like the steam from the slaking lime, a memory that rose unbidden and then faded. When the path was clear and the firewood restocked, the dweller returned inside, stamped the snow from the leather shoes, and closed the door on the white world, entering the other white world of the cottage. The contrast between the snow outside and the limewash inside was a subtle one, for both were white, but of different qualities. The snow a cold, glittering white, and the walls a warm, matte white that seemed to hold the memory of the fire. The dweller built up the hearth and sat close to it, letting the warmth seep into the chilled hands and feet, and looked around the room with a quiet satisfaction that was not pride, but something gentler, a simple recognition that the work of autumn had been worthwhile, and that the cottage was as ready as it could be for whatever remained of the winter. The long evenings of January and February were filled with the comfortable silence of deep winter, a silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional patter of snowmelt dripping from the thatch. The dweller knitted by the fire, the wooden needles clicking softly together, the grey wool growing into a shape that would warm the feet in the cold months still to come. The lamp burned at the elbow, and its light, caught and returned by the white walls, made a small bright island in the vast dark of the winter night, an island that was enough. As the weeks passed and the first faint signs of spring began to appear, the lengthening of the days by a few minutes, the sound of a single bird singing in the hedge, the dweller continued to live within the white walls, with the same quiet routine. The memory of the whitewashing had by now receded into the general background of the past, a pleasant recollection that surfaced occasionally when the light fell on the walls in a certain way, or when the dweller touched the slightly gritty surface and thought of the kiln, the slaking, the careful strokes of the brush. It had been a good work, a useful work, and it had made the dark winter easier to bear. One evening in late February, when the sun had set a little later than before, and the sky held a lingering band of pale gold at the horizon, the dweller sat on the stool and looked at the white walls with a new attention, seeing them not as the product of labor, but simply as part of the cottage, as permanent and natural as the oak beams and the packed earth floor. The whiteness was just the color of the room now, nothing remarkable, nothing to be praised or admired, only a quiet fact that had settled into the dweller's life without disturbance. That night, as the dweller lay on the straw mattress, with the wool blanket drawn close and the fire banked for sleep, the white walls stood all around in the darkness, invisible and yet present, holding the memory of the flame and the promise of the morning. The wind had risen outside, a low moan that moved through the bare branches at the hazel hedge, but inside the cottage the air was still and calm. The dweller closed the eyes and let the mind drift across the small world of the room, the hearth and the bed and the stool and the shelf, all of them held within the pale shell that had been made from limestone and fire and water and patient hands. The dark winter of 1550 was passing, slowly and imperceptibly, into the first hints of spring, and the cottage would remain bright through all the seasons to come, a quiet legacy of the autumn's work. The dweller breathed slowly and deeply, the smell of wood smoke and lime and wool filling the senses, and then, without effort or intention, slipped into the deep and restful sleep that comes to those who have done their work well and rest in a space made peaceful by their own hands.